Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The rain started as a whisper somewhere past the state line, just a few drops speckling the windshield while the wipers stayed off. Ephraim Calder had been driving long enough to know that kind of rain, the polite kind that gave you warning before it turned mean. He'd left the depot in Terre Haute just after midnight with a full load of agricultural equipment headed for a distribution center outside Paducah, and the weather report had mentioned scattered showers but nothing worth worrying about. The kind of forecast that truckers learned to take with a grain of salt because weather moved faster than reports could track it. Especially out here where the land flattened and the sky opened up like a vast, unblinking eye. He'd been running this route for 3 years now, knew every exit and rest stop, every stretch where the road dipped just enough to collect standing water when it rained hard. The familiarity should have been comforting, but tonight it felt different, like the road itself had changed while he wasn't looking. By the time he crossed into Kentucky, the rain had graduated from polite to insistent, fat drops hammering the windshield in a steady rhythm that made the wipers work double time. The highway stretched ahead in a ribbon of wet asphalt, the white lines reflecting his headlights in a way that made them look like they were floating just above the surface. Traffic had thinned out to almost nothing, just the occasional set of taillights in the distance that would disappear around a curve before he could catch up to them. The radio had gone static an hour back, nothing but white noise and the occasional burst of what might have been a voice but was probably just interference from the storm. Ephraim didn't mind the silence. He'd spent enough nights alone in the cab to find a kind of peace in it. The isolation that other drivers complained about, but he'd learned to appreciate. It was just him and the road and the rain, and for now, that was enough. The first sign that something was off came at mile marker 47, right where the highway curved north toward the river crossing. He'd driven past this spot hundreds of times, knew it well enough to navigate it half asleep, but tonight there was something new. A large orange detour sign planted on the shoulder, its reflective surface catching his headlights and throwing them back in a harsh glare. The arrow pointed toward an exit he'd never taken, a narrow ramp that led away from the highway and disappeared into the trees. Ephraim frowned, slowing the rig as he approached. Detours weren't unusual during storm season. Roads flooded, bridges washed out, and the highway department would reroute traffic until they could clear the damage. But he hadn't seen any construction warnings on the message boards, hadn't heard anything on the CB before it went dead. The sign looked official enough, the standard highway department orange with the black lettering, but something about it felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite name. He thought about ignoring it, pushing straight through on the main highway and taking his chances, but the rain was coming down harder now, and visibility was dropping fast. If there was a real washout ahead, he could end up stuck or worse, and with the load he was carrying, he couldn't afford to take that risk. The detour might add time to his route, but at least it would keep him moving. He eased the rig onto the exit ramp, the tires hissing on the wet pavement as he followed the curve down and away from the highway. The road here was narrower, barely 2 lanes, and the trees pressed in close on both sides, like they were trying to reclaim the asphalt. His headlights cut through the rain in narrow cones that didn't reach far enough, and the darkness beyond felt deeper than it should have, thicker somehow, like it was pushing back against the light. The detour signs kept appearing at regular intervals, each one confirming that he was still on the right path, but Ephraim couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The signs looked identical, same orange, same black lettering, same reflective coating, but they felt too perfect, too clean for something that should have been put up in a hurry during a storm. And there was something else. something he couldn't quite put his finger on until he was almost past the third sign. The lettering was just slightly off, the font not quite matching the standard highway department style. It was a small detail, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice, but Ephraim had spent years looking at road signs and his eye had learned to catch those inconsistencies. He told himself it didn't mean anything, that maybe the highway department had updated their templates or used a different contractor. But the unease that had been building in his gut since he left the highway grew stronger. The road continued to narrow, the pavement rough and poorly maintained, and Ephraim had to slow down to navigate the potholes that appeared in his headlights like dark craters filled with rainwater. The wipers were working overtime now, struggling to keep up with the deluge, and the sound of rain on the cab roof was almost deafening. He couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead, and every curve felt like a gamble, like he might round the next bend and find the road completely washed out or blocked by a fallen tree. He thought about turning around, but the road was too narrow for the rig, and backing up in these conditions would be suicide. He was committed now, stuck on this detour whether he liked it or not, and all he could do was keep moving forward and hope it led back to the highway before things got worse. Then he saw the lights. At first he thought it was another vehicle, maybe a car that had taken the same detour, but as he got closer he realized the lights weren't moving. They were stationary, positioned in the middle of the road, and they had that distinctive pattern of emergency flashers. Ephraim's stomach tightened. Someone had broken down or had an accident, and out here in the middle of nowhere during a storm like this, that could be a death sentence. He slowed the rig to a crawl, his eyes straining to make out details through the rain. The lights belonged to a car, an older sedan from what he could tell, sitting at an angle across both lanes like it had spun out and come to rest blocking the road. The driver's door was hanging open, and he could see dark shapes that might have been belongings scattered on the pavement around it. He brought the rig to a stop about 30 feet back, leaving enough room to maneuver if he needed to, and sat there for a moment trying to decide what to do. Every instinct was telling him to be careful, that something about this situation didn't add up. The car looked wrong somehow, staged, like it had been positioned there deliberately rather than spinning out naturally. And where was the driver? If they'd gotten out to look for help, they should have been visible in his headlights, or at least left some kind of trail, but there was nothing. Just the car and the rain and the darkness pressing in from all sides. Ephraim reached for the CB radio out of habit before remembering it was still dead. Nothing but static. His cell phone showed no signal, not surprising given how far off the main highway they were and how thick the storm had gotten. He made his decision. He couldn't just sit here. If someone was hurt, they might need help, and leaving them out in this weather would be as good as killing them himself. He grabbed his flashlight from the console and his rain slicker from behind the seat, then pushed open the door and stepped down into the storm. The rain hit him like a physical force, cold and hard, soaking through his clothes almost instantly despite the slicker. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar that drowned out everything else, and he had to squint just to see a few feet in front of him. He made his way toward the car, his boots splashing through puddles that had already formed on the cracked pavement, the flashlight beam cutting through the rain in a weak cone that barely illuminated anything. As he got closer to the car, he could see more details. The vehicle was old, probably from the early 90s, with rust eating through the wheel wells and a cracked taillight held together with duct tape. The license plate was so covered in mud he couldn't read it, and the open driver's door was swinging slightly in the wind, the hinges creaking in a way that made his skin crawl. He swept the flashlight across the interior, but it was empty. No driver, no passengers, no sign that anyone had been in it recently except for a duffel bag on the back seat and what looked like fast food wrappers on the floor. The keys were still in the ignition, and when he leaned in closer he could see that the gas gauge was reading full. A car with a full tank didn't just break down in the middle of the road. And a driver didn't abandon a running vehicle with the keys still in it unless something was seriously wrong. Ephraim straightened up, his unease crystallizing into something sharper. This wasn't an accident. This was a setup. The realization hit him with the force of the rain, and suddenly all the pieces clicked into place. The detour signs that looked just slightly wrong, the narrow road that seemed designed to funnel traffic into a specific path, and now this conveniently placed breakdown blocking the only way forward. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to create this situation, and that meant they were still around somewhere, watching and waiting for whoever came along. His hand tightened on the flashlight and he took a step back toward the rig, his eyes scanning the darkness on either side of the road. The trees were too thick to see into, the rain too heavy to make out any movement, but he could feel it now, that prickling sensation on the back of his neck that told him he wasn't alone. He was halfway back to the cab when he heard the engine. Not his rig, something else coming from behind him, back the way he'd come. He spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the rain to illuminate a vehicle approaching fast, its headlights off but its shape just barely visible in the darkness. A pickup truck, old and battered, moving with the kind of reckless speed that only made sense if the driver knew exactly where they were going. Ephraim broke into a run, his boots slipping on the wet pavement as he tried to reach the rig before the truck caught up to him. He could hear it getting closer, the engine roaring, and then the headlights snapped on all at once, catching him in their glare and turning the rain into a wall of white light. He reached the rig and hauled himself up into the cab, slamming the door and hitting the lock with one hand while the other fumbled for the ignition. The diesel engine coughed to life with a sound that was almost reassuring in its familiarity, and he slammed the rig into gear, ready to push the sedan out of the way if he had to. But the pickup truck had already stopped, pulling up alongside the sedan and blocking any route forward. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out. Tall, wearing a heavy rain slicker with the hood up, their face hidden in shadow. They stood there for a moment, just watching, and then they reached back into the truck and pulled out something long. A tool, maybe, or a weapon. Ephraim couldn't tell through the rain, but he wasn't about to wait and find out. He threw the rig into reverse, the transmission grinding in protest as the truck began to back up. The figure started walking toward him, not running, but moving with that same deliberate pace that suggested they had all the time in the world, like they knew he had nowhere to go. Ephraim kept reversing, his eyes flicking between the mirrors and the windshield, trying to navigate the narrow road backwards while keeping the figure in sight. The rain was making it nearly impossible to see, the wipers barely keeping up, and twice he felt the rear wheels slip on the muddy shoulder before he managed to correct. The figure kept coming, closing the distance slowly but steadily, and Ephraim realized with a sick certainty that they were herding him, pushing him back toward whatever was waiting further down the detour. Then he saw the second set of lights, behind him this time, blocking the road he'd just traveled. Another vehicle, another figure stepping out into the rain. Ephraim's chest tightened. He was boxed in, trapped between two vehicles on a road that was too narrow to turn around. His mind raced through options and came up empty. He couldn't go forward, couldn't go back, and trying to push through would likely end with him stuck or disabled, at the mercy of whoever had set this trap. The CB was still dead, his phone still showing no signal, and there was no one else on this road who could help him. He was on his own, and he was running out of time. The figure from the pickup had reached the front of his rig now, standing just outside the range of his headlights, and Ephraim could see what they were holding. A tire iron, long and heavy, the kind of thing that could punch through a windshield or cave in a skull if used with enough force. The figure tilted their head, studying the rig like they were deciding the best way to get inside, and then they started walking along the driver's side, tapping the tire iron against the trailer as they went. The sound was rhythmic, almost casual, metal on metal cutting through the roar of the rain. Ephraim's hand moved to the door lock, making sure it was secure, and he reached under the seat for the steel pry bar he kept there for emergencies. It wasn't much against a tire iron, but it was better than nothing. The figure reached the driver's door and stopped. For a long moment, they just stood there, close enough that Ephraim could see the water running off their slicker, could see the shape of their jaw beneath the hood. And then they raised the tire iron and brought it down hard against the window. The glass held, spiderwebbing from the impact but not breaking, and Ephraim flinched back even though he'd been expecting it. The figure hit the window again and again, each impact sending new cracks racing across the glass. It was only a matter of time before it gave way, and then there would be nothing between Ephraim and whatever they had planned for him. He gripped the pry bar tighter, his knuckles white, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard it felt like it might break through. The glass shattered on the fourth hit, exploding inward in a shower of fragments that caught the light from the dashboard and glittered like ice. The figure reached through the gap, their hand fumbling for the door handle, and Ephraim swung the pry bar with everything he had. It connected with the solid impact that he felt all the way up his arm, and the figure jerked back with a sound that might have been a curse or a grunt of pain. Ephraim didn't wait to see if he'd done any real damage. He threw open the passenger door and dropped out into the rain, landing hard on the pavement and rolling to absorb the impact. His shoulders screamed in protest, but he forced himself to his feet and started running, not toward the road but into the trees, crashing through the underbrush with the rain hammering down and the darkness swallowing him whole. Behind him he could hear shouting, voices cutting through the storm, and then the sound of engines revving. They were coming after him, and they had vehicles while he was on foot in terrain he didn't know. But the trees were thick here, the undergrowth heavy enough to slow them down, and if he could just get far enough away, he might be able to circle back to the highway or find somewhere to hide until morning. His lungs were burning, his legs pumping, and every breath tasted like rain and panic. He didn't know how long he ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time losing all meaning in the darkness. But eventually he had to stop, his body refusing to go any further. He collapsed behind a fallen log, gasping for air, the rain running down his face and mixing with what might have been tears or might have been just more water. He couldn't tell anymore. He stayed there for what felt like forever, listening for any sound of pursuit, but all he could hear was the rain and his own ragged breathing. The voices had faded, or maybe they'd given up, or maybe they were just waiting for him to make a mistake. His clothes were soaked through, his skin numb with cold, and he knew he couldn't stay here much longer. Hypothermia would kill him just as surely as whatever those people had planned, and at least if he kept moving, he had a chance. He forced himself to his feet, using the log for support, and tried to get his bearings. The rain made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction, but somewhere to his right he thought he could see a faint glow that might have been lights. The highway, maybe, or a house, or another trap. He had no way to know, but he had to take the chance. He started moving again, slower this time, picking his way through the undergrowth with his hands outstretched to avoid walking into trees. The glow grew brighter as he got closer, resolving into actual lights, not the harsh white of headlights but the warmer yellow of floodlights, the kind you'd see at a business or a way station. He approached cautiously, staying low, until he could make out the shape of a building through the rain. It was small, single-story, with a covered awning out front and what looked like gas pumps underneath. A truck stop, abandoned by the look of it, but the light suggested someone was still using it for something. He could see vehicles parked around back, several pickups and a van, and his stomach dropped as he recognized one of them. The same pickup that had blocked the road, that had trapped him against the sedan. He was about to back away, to disappear into the trees and find another route, when he heard the sound of a door opening. He froze, pressing himself against the trunk of a pine tree, and watched as a figure emerged from the building. They were wearing a rain slicker like the others, but this one was different. Official-looking, with reflective stripes across the shoulders and back. The figure crossed to one of the pickups and pulled something from the bed, and in the brief moment when they passed through the light, Ephraim saw their face clearly. It was a man, middle-aged, with a weathered face, and the kind of build that came from years of hard work. And he was wearing a uniform underneath the slicker, the kind that highway patrol or county sheriffs wore. Ephraim's blood ran cold. This wasn't just some random group of criminals working the detour for whatever they could steal from stranded motorists. This was organized, official, with law enforcement involved either directly or through someone turning a blind eye. And that meant there was no help coming, no rescue, no one he could turn to who wouldn't be part of the same system that had set this trap in the first place. He was truly on his own, and the rain kept falling, and somewhere in the darkness behind him were people who wanted him dead or worse, and he had nowhere left to run. Ephraim stayed behind the pine tree for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, his breath coming in shallow gasps that he tried to keep quiet despite the roar of the rain. The man in the uniform, and it was definitely a uniform now that he could see it clearly, the kind of dark blue with county patches that marked Sheriff's Department, was loading something into the pickup truck bed, working with the efficient movements of someone who'd done this many times before. Ephraim couldn't make out what exactly was being transferred, but the shapes looked like containers, maybe jerry cans or storage boxes, the kind of thing you'd use if you were running an operation that needed to be mobile and leave no trace. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew about how the world worked. But the pieces wouldn't fit together in any way that made him feel safer. The rain had soaked through every layer of clothing he had, and his teeth were starting to chatter despite his efforts to stay still and silent. The cold was getting worse, that bone-deep chill that came from being wet and exposed for too long, and he knew he couldn't stay here much longer without risking serious trouble. But moving meant risk too. One wrong step, one snapped branch or splash in a puddle, and they'd know exactly where he was. The truck stop had maybe 4 or 5 vehicles parked around it that he could see, which meant at least that many people inside or nearby, and all of them were working together in whatever this operation was. The odds weren't in his favor, not by a long shot, but staying in the woods and waiting for hypothermia to set in wasn't much of an alternative either. He was trying to decide on his next move when the door to the truck stop opened again, and 2 more figures emerged. One was another man in a rain slicker, this one without any visible uniform underneath, and the other was someone Ephraim recognized with a jolt that felt like ice water in his veins. It was the figure who'd smashed his window, the one he'd hit with the pry bar, and they were moving fine. No limp, no sign of injury, which meant his swing either hadn't connected as solidly as he'd thought, or they were tougher than they looked. The 2 of them stood under the awning for a moment, having what looked like a heated discussion, their body language tense, and then the uniformed man from earlier joined them. Ephraim couldn't hear what they were saying over the rain, but he could see gestures being made toward the road, toward the direction he'd run, and he knew they were talking about him. The discussion seemed to reach some kind of conclusion, because the 3 of them split up, the non-uniform-synth figure heading back inside, the one who'd broken his window climbing into one of the pickups, and the uniformed man walking toward another vehicle parked around the side of the building. Ephraim watched as engines started and headlights came on, cutting through the rain in harsh white beams that swept across the parking area. They were organizing a search, spreading out to cover more ground, and suddenly the woods didn't feel like adequate cover anymore. He needed to move, and he needed to do it now while they were still getting organized, while there was still confusion he could use to his advantage. The problem was figuring out where to go, back toward the detour road was suicide. Deeper into the woods was just delaying the inevitable, and trying to make it to the highway on foot through terrain he didn't know. In the dark and the rain felt like a long shot at best. He made his decision. The truck stop might be their base of operations, but it also had resources. Vehicles with keys potentially left in them. A phone that might work. Maybe even weapons or supplies he could use. It was risky, but staying out here was riskier. And at least inside he'd have walls and a roof while he figured out his next move. He waited until the pickup trucks had pulled out onto the road and their taillights had disappeared into the rain before moving, keeping low and using the parked vehicles for cover as he approached the building. The windows were lit, but he couldn't see anyone moving inside from this angle, and the door the figures had been using was on the far side under the awning. He circled around to the back where a smaller door marked with a faded "Employees Only" sign hung slightly ajar, the frame warped enough that the latch didn't quite catch. Ephraim pushed it open slowly, wincing at the creak of old hinges, and slipped inside. He found himself in a storage room that smelled of mildew and old cardboard. Shelves lined with supplies that looked like they'd been sitting untouched for years. The fluorescent lights overhead were flickering irregularly, casting everything in a stuttering half-light that made the shadows jump and shift. He could hear voices coming from somewhere deeper in the building, muffled by walls but close enough to make his pulse quicken. He moved carefully between the shelves toward an interior door that stood partially open, giving him a view into what looked like the main room of the truck stop. There were tables and chairs scattered around, a counter with an old cash register, and maps spread out across one of the tables covered in markings he couldn't make out from this distance. 2 people were in the room. One was the figure who'd gone back inside earlier. Their rain slicker hung up now, revealing worn work clothes underneath, and the other was someone Ephraim hadn't seen before, a heavy-set man with a shaved head who was leaning over the maps and pointing at something. They were deep in conversation, their voices carrying just enough for Ephraim to catch fragments. "I should have grabbed him when we had the chance." Kinch said to be patient, that he'd come back to the rig. Been 3 hours now, and Corcoran's getting antsy. The names meant nothing to Ephraim, but the context was clear enough. They'd expected him to go back to his truck, had probably left it as bait, and were getting frustrated that their plan hadn't worked. The realization gave him a small, cold satisfaction. At least he'd done something right by running into the woods instead of trying to salvage his load. The conversation continued, and Ephraim caught more details, piecing together the operation as he listened. Kinch was apparently the one running things, the man with the tow truck who'd set up the detour system to funnel commercial vehicles onto isolated roads where they could be hijacked. Corcoran was the law enforcement connection, the one in uniform, using his authority to make sure no one looked too closely at the missing trucks or asked awkward questions about traffic patterns. They'd been running this for months at least, maybe longer, hitting truckers during storms when visibility was low and response times were slow. The cargo got stripped and sold. The trucks disappeared into chop shops or were repainted and resold across state lines, and the drivers, Ephraim's stomach turned as he realized they weren't talking about what happened to the drivers, which meant it was bad enough they didn't need to say it out loud. He needed to get out of here, and he needed evidence, something he could take to someone higher up the chain than county law enforcement, someone who couldn't be bought or threatened into silence. His eyes scanned the room looking for anything useful and landed on the maps. They were covered in markings, red circles around highway exits, notation about traffic cameras, schedules for patrol routes. That was evidence, hard evidence that would be impossible to explain away if it got into the right hands. The problem was the 2 people standing right next to it, and the fact that Ephraim had no way to photograph it with his phone, having no signal, and no way to carry the maps out without being seen. He was still trying to work out a plan when the door at the front of the building opened and someone else walked in, bringing a gust of rain and cold air with them. It was the uniformed man, Corcoran, apparently. and he looked frustrated and wet, water dripping from his slicker onto the worn linoleum floor. "Nothing," he said without preamble. "Checked the perimeter twice, no sign of him. Either he's hunkered down somewhere waiting for morning, or he's trying to make it to the highway on foot." The bald man straightened up from the maps, his expression darkening. "Kinch isn't going to like this. We can't have someone running around out there who knows about the setup, especially not with the operation planned for tomorrow night. We need more bodies on this, need to sweep the whole area before he can get to a phone or flag down another driver." Corcoran shook his head, water flying from his hair. "Can't pull more people without raising questions. We keep this contained, keep it looking like a normal night, and hope we find him before he becomes a problem." The conversation continued, but Ephraim had stopped listening. His mind caught on what the bald man had said. An operation planned for tomorrow night. Which meant this wasn't a one-time thing, wasn't just about him and his truck. They had another hijacking set up, another driver who'd be routed onto that same detour road and trapped the same way he'd been. And if he didn't get out of here, didn't get word to someone who could stop it, that driver would end up dead or disappeared like however many others had come before him. The weight of that knowledge settled over him like a physical thing, heavier than the cold and the fear and the exhaustion. He couldn't just save himself. He had to stop this. Had to make sure these people paid for what they'd been doing. But first he had to survive the night. He was backing away from the door, trying to retreat to the storage room before anyone noticed him, when his boot caught on something. A toolbox someone had left on the floor, half hidden in shadow. It scraped across the linoleum with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of the room, and Ephraim froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. No one reacted, and he thought maybe they hadn't heard it over the rain on the roof. Then the bald man's head snapped toward the storage room doorway, and his eyes locked onto Ephraim's face. "We got company!" he shouted, already moving. And Ephraim ran. He crashed back through the storage room, knocking over shelves in his wake to slow pursuit, and hit the back door at full speed. The rain was a shock after the relative warmth inside, but he didn't slow down. Couldn't afford to. Just kept running toward the tree line with shouts echoing behind him. He heard the door bang open, heard boots pounding on wet pavement, and then something whistled past his head close enough that he felt the displacement of air. They were shooting at him. The realization came with a detached kind of clarity, like his brain had decided that if they were shooting, then panic wasn't going to help. He just needed to move faster and make himself a harder target. He zigzagged as he ran, using the parked vehicles for cover, and made it to the trees just as another shot kicked up mud a few feet to his left. The woods swallowed him again, and this time he didn't stop to catch his breath, just kept pushing forward with branches whipping at his face and undergrowth grabbing at his boots. Behind him, he could hear them crashing through the forest, could see flashlight beams cutting through the rain and the darkness, and he knew they were tracking him by sound because there was no way they could see him in this. He tried to move more quietly, but speed seemed more important than stealth, and his lungs were burning and his legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to keep going. The rain was his enemy now, instead of his ally. Every splash, every broken branch was like a beacon telling them exactly where he was, and the cold was making his muscles slow and clumsy. He ran for what felt like miles, but was probably less than one. The terrain sloping downward now, and then his boot came down on nothing but air, and he was falling. He hit hard, rolling down a muddy embankment that hadn't been visible in the darkness, and came to rest in a shallow creek that was running high and fast with storm runoff. The water was shockingly cold, and for a moment he just lay there stunned, tasting mud and blood from where he'd bit his lip. Then the sound of voices from above brought him back to himself, and he forced his body to move, crawling further downstream, where the bank overhung the water enough to create a small hollow. He wedged himself into it, the cold water flowing around him up to his chest, and tried to control his breathing while the flashlight beams swept overhead. They were close enough that he could hear individual words now. Lost him at the drop-off. Check downstream. He couldn't have gone far. Kinch is going to be pissed. Ephraim pressed himself further back into the hollow, the mud of the bank cold and slick against his back, and watched the lights play across the water. One of them, Corcoran, by the sound of his voice, was arguing that they should call it off until morning, that searching in the dark and the rain was more likely to result in one of them getting hurt than finding anything. But the bald man, who someone called Kinch now that Ephraim was listening carefully, insisted they keep looking. He's seen too much, knows too much. We find him tonight or we shut down the whole operation and scatter, and I'm not about to let 3 years of work go to waste because one driver got lucky. So Kinch was the bald man, the one running things, not the tow truck operator like Ephraim had thought. That changed his mental map of the organization, but it didn't change his situation. He was still hunted, still cold, still trapped. The voices and lights eventually moved away, heading further downstream, and Ephraim stayed in his hollow counting seconds and trying to decide when it would be safe to move. His whole body was shaking now, uncontrollable tremors that he couldn't stop even when he clenched his jaw and balled his fists. The water was stealing his heat faster than his body could generate it, and he knew he couldn't stay here much longer without losing consciousness. But climbing out of the creek meant exposing himself, meant being visible if anyone came back to check the area. He gave it 5 minutes by his count, though time felt elastic and unreliable, and then forced himself to move. His muscles barely responded, cramping and sluggish from the cold, but he managed to drag himself out of the water and up the opposite bank. The rain was still coming down hard enough to wash away his tracks almost as fast as he made them, which was something at least. He oriented himself by the sound of the creek, following it downstream on the theory that it would eventually meet up with a larger body of water, maybe the river he'd seen on the maps back in the truck stop. Rivers meant bridges, and bridges meant roads, a way back to civilization and help. It was a thin hope, but it was all he had. The walking was torture, each step an exercise in willpower as his body screamed at him to stop and rest. His wet clothes chafed against skin that was probably approaching hypothermic, and his vision kept trying to narrow into a tunnel that blocked out everything except the ground directly in front of him. He knew those were warning signs, knew he was in serious trouble, but there was nothing he could do except keep moving and hope he found shelter or help before his body gave out completely. The creek led him through terrain that got progressively rougher, the forest giving way to rocky outcrops and steep slopes that he had to navigate carefully to avoid another fall. Time lost all meaning. He might have been walking for 20 minutes or 2 hours. He couldn't tell anymore. Then he saw lights ahead, not flashlights but steady lights, the kind that came from buildings or street lamps. He forced himself to move faster, hope giving him a burst of energy that his body drew from reserves he didn't know he had. As he got closer, the lights resolved into shapes. A small building, maybe a ranger station or maintenance shed, and beyond it, the dark line of a road. Not the detour road with its false signs and waiting ambush, but a real road, wider and better maintained, with the kind of drainage ditches and guardrails that marked proper highway department work. He'd made it out, had managed to circle back to somewhere near the main highway, and the relief was so intense it almost dropped him to his knees. The building was dark despite the exterior lights, and when Ephraim tried the door it was locked. A sign identified it as a highway maintenance depot, unstaffed at night, which meant no help but also no danger. There was an awning that provided some shelter from the rain, and Ephraim collapsed under it, his back against the wall, and just focused on breathing for a while. His phone was ruined, waterlogged beyond any hope of function, but the road meant traffic would eventually come by. All he had to do was wait for morning, flag down a passing vehicle that wasn't part of Kinch's operation, and get to someone who could help. The state police, maybe, or the FBI if the corruption went deep enough in the local department. He had information they needed, had seen faces and heard names and knew about the operation planned for tomorrow night. He must have dozed off because the next thing he knew it was lighter. The rain reduced to a drizzle, and the sky that pre-dawn gray that meant sunrise wasn't far off. He was still cold, still soaked through, but alive and relatively safe for the moment. The road in front of the maintenance depot was empty, but as he watched, a vehicle appeared in the distance, headlights cutting through the morning mist. Ephraim pushed himself to his feet, his muscles protesting, and moved toward the road edge to flag it down. The vehicle got closer, and he could see it was a truck, a big rig like his own, and hope surged again. Another trucker would understand, would help, would get him to safety. The truck began to slow as it approached, and Ephraim stepped further into the road, waving his arms. Then the truck pulled to a stop, and the driver's door opened, and Ephraim's blood turned to ice. The man climbing down from the cab was wearing a rain slicker, and a familiar face was visible beneath the hood. It was Corcoran, the highway patrol sergeant, and he was smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Well now," Corcoran said, his hand resting casually on his belt near where a service weapon would be holstered. "Looks like we found our lost driver after all. Kinch is going to be so pleased." Ephraim turned to run, but his body was too slow, too exhausted, and before he'd made it 3 steps, hands grabbed him from behind. Someone else had been in the truck, someone he hadn't seen, and they wrestled him to the ground with professional efficiency. His face pressed into wet gravel and zip ties bit into his wrists, and Corcoran's boots appeared in his field of vision. "You led us on quite a chase," the sergeant said conversationally. "Made us work for it, I'll give you that. But you made a mistake thinking the highway was safe, thinking any road out here was safe. We own these roads, friend. Every mile marker, every exit, every depot. You were never going to get away." They hauled Ephraim to his feet and started walking him toward the truck, and he realized with a sick certainty that he'd been herded again, that even his escape had been controlled and guided to bring him to exactly where they wanted him. The truck's trailer was open, empty except for some tie-down straps and a dark stain on the floor that might have been oil or might have been something else. Corcoran climbed up first and reached down to pull Ephraim up after him, and the last thing Ephraim saw before they pushed him into the darkness was the road stretching away into the mist, empty and indifferent to his fate. The trailer doors slammed shut and locked from the outside, and he was alone in the dark with the sound of the engine starting up and the truck beginning to move, carrying him back toward mile marker 47 and whatever waited for him there. The darkness inside the trailer was absolute, the kind of black that pressed against your eyes and made you doubt whether they were open or closed. Ephraim could feel the truck moving beneath him, the vibration of the road through the metal floor, and every bump and turn sent him sliding across the slick surface until he managed to wedge himself into a corner where 2 walls met. His wrists were screaming from the zip ties cutting into them, pulled tight enough that his hands were starting to go numb, and the cold was still working its way through his body despite being out of the rain. The trailer smelled like diesel and rust, and something organic that had gone bad, and he tried not to think too hard about what that might be, or what it meant for the drivers who'd been here before him. He forced himself to focus on immediate problems, rather than spiraling into panic about what would happen when the truck stopped. The zip ties were industrial grade, the kind that wouldn't break no matter how much he twisted or pulled, but they were also the kind that had a weak point if you knew where to look. The locking mechanism was a one-way ratchet, designed to tighten but not loosen, and the only way to defeat it without cutting was to break the pawl that held it in place. Ephraim had seen a training video years ago about escaping restraints. One of those things the company made you watch after a hijacking incident down in Texas, and he'd filed it away as interesting but probably useless information. Now he was grateful for every minute of that boring presentation as he worked his hands around, trying to get enough leverage to snap the mechanism. The technique required getting the ties positioned just right, and then applying sudden force in a specific direction, pulling outward while bringing your arms down hard like you were trying to do a lat pull-down at the gym. The problem was doing it in pitch darkness while exhausted and half-frozen, in a moving truck that kept throwing off his balance. He tried 3 times and failed, the plastic digging deeper into his wrists each time he tensed against it, and he could feel warm wetness that was probably blood mixing with the rainwater still soaking his sleeves. On the 4th attempt, something gave. Not the tie itself, but his left shoulder, a sharp pop of pain that made him gasp and nearly made him black out. He'd dislocated it or torn something. He couldn't tell which in the dark, but his hands were still bound, and now he had a new problem to deal with. He sat there for a moment, breathing through the pain, trying to assess how bad the damage was. His left arm wasn't responding right, the shoulder joint feeling wrong in a way that made his stomach turn, but he could still move his fingers even if the motion sent fresh jolts of agony up his arm. He'd have to manage it, would have to push through and hope it held together long enough to matter. The truck was still moving, had been for maybe 20 minutes by his estimate, which meant they were either taking him back to the truck stop or to wherever they did the actual work of processing hijacked vehicles. Neither option was good, but he had to be ready for when the doors opened, had to have some kind of plan, even if it was just making a desperate run for it and hoping he got lucky. The truck began to slow, the engine note changing as it downshifted, and Ephraim felt his pulse kick up another notch. He pushed himself to his feet, his bad shoulder protesting, and moved toward where he thought the doors were. His fingers found the cold metal and traced along it, looking for any kind of gap or weakness, but the trailer was solid and the doors were locked from the outside with no interior release. He was trapped completely, dependent on them opening those doors if he wanted any chance at all, and that meant they controlled the when and how of whatever came next. He backed away from the doors and positioned himself to the side, figuring that at least if he wasn't directly in front of them when they opened, he might have a split second of surprise to work with. The truck came to a complete stop and the engine shut off, leaving a ringing silence broken only by the sound of rain still pattering against the trailer roof. Ephraim could hear voices outside, muffled but getting closer, and he recognized Corcoran's distinctive gravel-rough tone mixed with someone else's voice that might have been Kinch. They were discussing something, their words not quite clear enough to make out, and then there was the sound of metal scraping metal as someone worked the lock. Light spilled in as the doors swung open, blinding after the darkness, and Ephraim had to squint against it. When his vision adjusted, he could see 3 figures silhouetted against the gray dawn: Corcoran, Kinch, and someone else he didn't recognize. A lean man with a tow truck operator's build, wearing coveralls stained with grease and what looked like old blood. "Out," Kinch said. Not a request, but a command. And when Ephraim didn't move immediately, the lean man stepped forward and grabbed his arm. The bad arm, naturally, and the pain that shot through his shoulder made him stumble forward and nearly fall out of the trailer. Corcoran caught him almost casually, one hand on his elbow, and guided him down to the ground. They were back at the truck stop, Ephraim realized as he got his bearings. The same parking lot and awning and building he'd fled from hours earlier. His rig was there too, parked off to the side near the gas pumps, and seeing it gave him a pang that was almost physical. All that work to escape, and he'd ended up right back where he'd started, except now he was injured and restrained and surrounded by people who had no reason to let him live. They walked him toward the building, Corcoran on one side and the lean man on the other, with Kinch leading the way. The rain had tapered off to a light drizzle, but the ground was still soaked, puddles everywhere reflecting the gray sky. Ephraim's boots squelched with each step, and he could feel water still trapped in his clothes, making everything heavier. They took him in through the front door this time, not bothering with stealth, and he found himself in the same main room he'd spied on from the storage area. The maps were still spread on the table, but now there were more of them, detailed topographic charts with routes marked in different colors and annotations written in a cramped hand. A laptop sat open on another table showing what looked like traffic camera feeds, multiple windows cycling through different views of highways and intersections. Kinch gestured to a chair, and the lean man pushed Ephraim into it, not gently. The zip ties were still on his wrists, but they pulled his arms around behind the chair and secured them to the backrest with more ties, then did the same with his ankles to the chair legs. When they were done, he couldn't move anything except his head, and even that made his shoulders scream in protest. Kinch pulled up another chair and sat down facing him, close enough that Ephraim could smell coffee on his breath and see the early morning stubble on his jaw. "Let's talk," Kinch said, his voice conversational like they were discussing the weather instead of whatever was about to happen. "You've caused us a significant amount of trouble tonight, but I'm willing to consider that maybe we can work something out." Ephraim didn't respond, just stared back at him, and Kinch's expression hardened slightly. "See, the problem is you've seen too much. You know about the detour, about this place, about our operation, and normally that would be the end of it. We can't have loose ends, can't risk someone talking to the wrong people. But you impressed me tonight. The way you handled yourself, the way you fought and ran and survived when most drivers would have folded. It takes a certain kind of person, someone with skills and instincts we could use." He leaned back in his chair, studying Ephraim like he was evaluating a piece of equipment. "So, here's my offer. You work with us. We've got another pickup tonight, another driver coming through who needs to be intercepted. You help make that go smooth, prove you're committed, and maybe we bring you in proper. You'd get a cut, get to keep driving, and you'd be protected by people who know how things really work out here." The offer hung in the air between them, and Ephraim felt a cold fury building beneath the exhaustion and pain. They wanted to turn him, wanted to make him part of whatever sick enterprise they'd built by preying on other drivers. People who were just trying to do their jobs, just trying to get their loads delivered and go home to their families, and these men were treating them like resources to be harvested. He thought about the dark stain on the trailer floor, thought about how many drivers had sat in this chair before him and been given the same offer, and wondered how many had taken it versus how many had refused and ended up disappeared. The silence stretched, and Kinch's expression shifted from patient to annoyed. "Not interested?" Kinch said, his tone harder now. "That's disappointing. I really did think you were smarter than that." He stood up and walked over to the table with the laptop, tapping a few keys. One of the camera feeds expanded to fill the screen, and Ephraim could see a highway view, traffic light at this early hour, but with a few vehicles visible, including several trucks. "See, the thing about this business is we've got it down to a science. We know which routes the commercial vehicles take, know their schedules and their loads and their stopping points. We've got people in dispatch offices, people in weigh stations, people in every level of the infrastructure that keeps the trucking industry moving. You think you're the first driver who thought about going to the authorities? We own the authorities. We've got 3 counties locked down, and anyone who makes noise gets handled before they can become a problem." Corcoran had been standing near the door, but now he moved closer, his hand resting on his service weapon in what was probably meant to be a casual gesture, but read as a threat. "We're offering you a way out," he said, his voice carrying that tone of false reasonableness that cops used when they wanted you to confess to something. "A way to survive this and even profit from it. But if you're not smart enough to take it, then you're just another problem that needs solving, and we've gotten very good at solving problems." He exchanged a look with Kinch that Ephraim couldn't quite read, some kind of silent communication passing between them. The lean man, who'd been standing off to the side, moved to the door and opened it, and two more people came in. One was the figure who'd originally broken his truck window, their face finally visible in the light as a woman in her 30s with cold eyes, and the other was someone new, a younger guy who moved with the nervous energy of someone who hadn't been doing this long. Kinch turned back to Ephraim, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Last chance. You're either with us or you're a liability, and we don't keep liabilities around. What's it going to be?" Ephraim met his eyes and said the only thing he could say, the only response that let him keep whatever was left of his self-respect. "Go to hell." The words came out rougher than he intended, his throat raw from cold and exhaustion, but they were clear enough. Kinch's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been respect or might have been irritation. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and then he was turning away and saying something to Corcoran that Ephraim couldn't hear over the sudden rushing sound in his ears. The sergeant moved toward him and Ephraim tensed, expecting a blow or worse, but instead Corcoran just cut the zip ties holding him to the chair. His arms and legs were still bound, but at least he wasn't completely immobilized anymore. They hauled him up and started walking him toward the back of the building, through a door that led to what looked like a garage bay. His rig was in there, pulled inside on the far side where a maintenance pit gaped open in the floor like a dark mouth. Tools were scattered on workbenches, and there was a heavy industrial smell of oil and metal and chemical solvents that burned in his nose. The lean man was doing something with Ephraim's truck, had the hood open, and was working on the engine with the practiced movements of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "See, we had your truck from the start," Kinch said, walking beside Ephraim like a tour guide showing off an attraction. "Soon as you took that first detour sign, we activated a kill switch in your electrical system. Something we installed 6 months back when your rig was in for maintenance at a shop we've got people in. Clean, remote, untraceable. The truck dies when we want it to, right where we want it to, and the driver has no choice but to stop and call for help. That's when we move in." He gestured toward the maintenance pit, and Ephraim's stomach dropped as he saw what was down there. Partially disassembled trucks, VIN plates scattered around, painting equipment and welding gear. They weren't just hijacking vehicles, they were completely erasing their identities and rebuilding them as something else. The woman with the cold eyes stepped forward, holding something that Ephraim couldn't quite make out in the dim lighting. "The problem with drivers," she said, her voice flat and emotionless, "is they always think they're going to be the exception. They think if they just fight hard enough or run fast enough or refuse to cooperate, somehow they'll make it out and expose us. But it doesn't work that way. We've been doing this for 3 years, processed over 50 rigs, and you know how many drivers have gotten away?" She paused for effect. 0, not 1, because we control everything, the roads, the timing, the response. You never had a chance. They positioned Ephraim at the edge of the maintenance pit, and he realized with cold certainty what they were planning. The pit was deep, easily 10 feet, with concrete sides and a floor stained with fluids and debris. A fall from this height with his hands and feet bound would likely break bones, maybe kill him outright if he landed wrong, and even if it didn't, the pit looked like it could be sealed off or filled in without much effort. A perfect place to dispose of someone who'd become inconvenient. His mind raced, trying to find an angle, any possible way out, but he was surrounded and restrained, and his body was already at its limit. The only thing he had left was time. If he could buy enough of it, maybe something would change, maybe an opportunity would present itself. "Wait," he said. the word coming out more desperate than he'd intended. Kinch paused, one eyebrow raised in question, and Ephraim scrambled for something that would make them hesitate. The dispatcher knows my route. When I don't check in, when I don't make my delivery window, they'll come looking. They'll track the last known position of my truck and they'll find that detour and they'll know something's wrong. It was thin, barely plausible, but it was all he had. Kinch studied him for a long moment and then he laughed, a dry sound without humor. Your dispatcher is already handled. Got a call an hour ago from you saying the truck broke down and you'd be delayed a day for repairs. Happens all the time, nothing suspicious about it. By the time anyone realizes something's actually wrong, your truck will have a new VIN and be running loads 3 states away. The lean man had finished whatever he was doing under the hood and slammed it shut with a bang that echoed through the garage. He walked over, wiping his hands on a rag, nodded to Kinch, and said something Ephraim didn't catch. The pieces were falling into place now, the full scope of what they'd built becoming clear. This wasn't just a handful of criminals working an isolated stretch of road. This was a network, coordinated and professional, with connections reaching into legitimate businesses and law enforcement and probably further than Ephraim could guess. They had systems and protocols and resources, and he was just one person with no backup and no way out. The futility of it threatened to overwhelm him, to make him just give up and accept whatever came next. But something stubborn in him refused to yield. Corcoran checked his watch and said something to Kinch about timing, about needing to get back on patrol before his shift supervisor started asking questions. They were wrapping up, getting ready to finish this so they could move on to the next phase of whatever operation they had planned. The woman moved behind Ephraim and he felt her hands on his back, ready to push. And he thought about his sister back in Indiana who'd probably never know what happened to him, about the delivery he'd been trying to make that would never arrive, about all the small ordinary pieces of a life that would just stop as if he'd never existed. And then, impossibly, he heard a sound that didn't belong, the distant wail of sirens getting closer. Everyone in the garage froze, listening. The sirens grew louder, multiple vehicles by the sound of it, and Kinch's expression shifted from confident to alarmed in the space of a heartbeat. "State Police," the lean man said, moving to one of the windows and peering out through grimy glass. 3 units, coming in hot." Corcoran swore, his hand dropping to his weapon, and Kinch was already moving toward the laptop, fingers flying over keys to shut down feeds and close windows. "How did they—" he started to say but didn't finish, his attention already shifting to damage control. The woman's hands left Ephraim's back and he swayed at the edge of the pit but didn't fall, his body finding balance through pure instinct. The sirens cut off abruptly as the vehicles arrived, doors slamming and authoritative voices cutting through the morning air. Someone was using a bullhorn, demanding that everyone inside come out with their hands visible, standard law enforcement procedure for a high-risk stop. Kinch looked at Corcoran with an expression that was part fury and part calculation. "This is on you," he said coldly. "Your network, your responsibility. Fix it or we all go down." Corcoran moved toward the door, but before he got there it burst open, and state troopers flooded in, weapons drawn, shouting commands that overlapped into an incomprehensible wall of sound. Ephraim saw Kinch's hand move toward something in his jacket and shouted a warning without thinking, and then everything happened at once. Troopers closing on Kinch, the lean man making a break for the back exit, the woman trying to use Ephraim as a shield. A trooper with sergeant's stripes separated from the group and moved directly toward Ephraim, assessing the situation with professional calm. "Get him down and clear," the sergeant ordered, and 2 troopers moved to comply, cutting the zip ties and helping Ephraim away from the pit and out of the immediate chaos. His legs barely held him, and his shoulder was still screaming, but he was alive, and he was free, and somehow against all odds, the cavalry had actually shown up. They guided him outside where an ambulance was already pulling into the lot, and he found himself sitting on the back bumper with a paramedic checking his vitals while state police moved through the truck stop like a coordinated machine. The rain had stopped completely now, and the sky was lightening toward actual dawn, gray giving way to pale blue. The sergeant who'd first spotted him came over once things inside were secured, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense bearing. "Mr. Calder?" she said, confirming his identity even though she clearly already knew who he was. "I'm Sergeant Mallory with the state police. We've been tracking this operation for 2 months, and your GPS unit gave us the final piece we needed to move in." Ephraim stared at her, trying to process that through the fog of exhaustion and shock. "My GPS?" he managed, and she nodded. Every commercial vehicle has one for dispatch tracking. But what these people didn't know is some of them, including yours, also have a secondary safety system that activates when the primary communication goes down. It's a new program, still being rolled out, but it meant we knew exactly where you were even when they thought they'd cut you off completely. She explained more as the paramedic worked. Details about how the investigation had started after multiple disappearances of truckers on this route. How they'd been building a case but needed concrete evidence and real-time intelligence to make arrests that would stick. Ephraim's capture and the subsequent hours of tracking him had given them exactly that. Footage of the detour signs being placed, recordings of conversations in the truck stop, physical evidence of the chop shop operation. They had Kinch, Corcoran, and most of the network in custody, with more arrests rolling out across 3 counties as warrants were executed. It was over, the whole sick enterprise collapsing under its own weight once the light hit it. Ephraim should have felt relief, victory even, but all he felt was numb and hollow, and very, very tired. They transported him to a hospital where doctors confirmed his shoulder was dislocated but not broken, where they treated him for mild hypothermia and dehydration and the various cuts and bruises he'd accumulated during his night of hell. The state police took his statement across several hours, gentle but thorough, and he told them everything he'd seen and heard. They assured him his truck would be returned once it was processed as evidence that his company had been notified and was being cooperative, that he'd probably have to testify when cases went to trial, but they'd make sure he was protected and supported. It was all very professional and compassionate and by the book, but it didn't change the fundamental truth that he'd come within minutes of disappearing forever into a system designed to erase people. He spent 2 days in the hospital before they cleared him to leave, and the company sent someone to drive him home since his truck was still impounded. The driver was an older guy named Marcus, who didn't ask questions, just made small talk about routes and weather and the normal safe topics that truckers use to pass time. Ephraim stared out the window as they drove, watching the highway unroll ahead of them, and every detour sign they passed made his stomach clench. He knew intellectually that Kinch's operation was shut down, that the false signs had been removed and the roads were safe again, but the knowledge didn't help. Trust, once broken, couldn't just be repaired with facts and reassurance. 3 months passed before the company cleared Ephraim to drive again. The official reason was the shoulder injury. It had required physical therapy, and the doctors wanted to make sure he had full range of motion before he went back to handling a rig. But Ephraim knew the real reason was in the psych evaluations they'd made him take, the careful questions about sleep patterns and stress responses and whether he felt ready to be back on the road. He'd answered honestly enough, said what he thought they wanted to hear, and eventually they'd signed off on his return to active duty. What he hadn't told them was about the dreams, the ones where he was still running through dark woods with voices behind him, or the way his hands would shake whenever he saw orange construction signs, or how he'd started taking secondary routes that added hours to his trips just to avoid certain stretches of highway. His first run back was a short haul, just a day trip down to Louisville and back with a partial load of electronics. Easy money, familiar roads, the kind of route they gave to new drivers still learning the ropes. Ephraim understood the message. They were easing him back in, testing to see if he could handle it, and he was determined to prove he could. He did his pre-trip inspection with extra care, checking every system twice, and when he finally pulled out of the depot, the relief was almost overwhelming. This was what he knew, what he was good at, and getting back behind the wheel felt like reclaiming a piece of himself that Kinch and his people had tried to take away. The truck responded to his touch like it always had, the familiar vibration of the diesel engine and the weight of the load behind him grounding him in the present moment. The route took him south on Interstate 65, straight highway with good visibility and regular traffic. No detours, no isolated back roads, just the steady flow of commerce that was the lifeblood of the country. Ephraim kept the CB on, listening to other drivers chat about road conditions and fuel prices and the usual topics that filled the airwaves. The voices were comforting in their ordinariness, a reminder that most people on these roads were just trying to do their jobs, that what had happened to him was an aberration rather than the norm. He made good time, the weather holding clear and dry, and by early afternoon he was pulling into the distribution center in Louisville to drop his load. The receiving clerk was friendly and efficient. The paperwork went through without issues, and within an hour Ephraim was back on the road heading north empty. That's when the rain started. Just a few drops at first, nothing concerning, but by the time he was 30 miles out of Louisville, it had developed into a steady downpour that reduced visibility and made the road surface slick. Ephraim's hands tightened on the wheel, and he felt his pulse quicken, that old familiar anxiety starting to build in his chest. He told himself it was just rain, that he'd driven through worse hundreds of times, that there was nothing to worry about. But his body wasn't listening to logic. His breathing was getting shallow, his vision narrowing, and he could feel sweat starting to bead on his forehead despite the cab being climate-controlled. He forced himself to focus on the basics, on the mechanical process of driving. Maintain speed, watch following distance, check mirrors, adjust wipers, break it down into small manageable pieces instead of thinking about the bigger picture. Mile marker 47 appeared ahead, and Ephraim's stomach dropped. He knew rationally that this wasn't the same stretch of road where it had happened, that 47 was just a number that appeared on highways all over the country, but the coincidence felt like the universe mocking him. He watched the marker pass, his eyes flicking to the shoulder looking for orange detour signs that he knew wouldn't be there. And then he was past it and nothing had happened. Just another mile marker on just another highway, meaningless and arbitrary. But his hands were shaking now, trembling against the wheel badly enough that he had to actively work to keep the truck steady in its lane. He needed to stop, needed to get himself under control before he became a danger to himself and everyone else on the road. There was a rest area coming up in 5 miles according to the signs, and Ephraim aimed for it like a drowning man swimming for shore. The rain was coming down harder now, the wipers working at full speed and barely keeping up, and every pair of headlights that appeared behind him in the mirrors made him tense. He knew it was irrational, knew that Kinch and Corcoran and the rest of them were in federal custody awaiting trial, but the knowledge didn't help. His brain had learned that highways were dangerous, that other vehicles were potential threats, and unlearning that wasn't something he could do through willpower alone. The rest area exit appeared and he took it carefully, the truck's tires hissing on wet pavement as he rolled into the parking area and found a spot away from the other vehicles. He shut off the engine and just sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel, trying to get his breathing under control. The rain drummed on the cab roof in a steady rhythm that should have been soothing, but instead felt oppressive, like it was trying to trap him inside. He thought about the stories other drivers had told him after the news broke about the hijacking ring. How many close calls there'd been, how many times someone had almost taken a detour or stopped to help a stranded vehicle, but something had made them keep going. Luck, instinct, divine intervention, whatever you wanted to call it, it was the thin line between making it home and disappearing without a trace. Ephraim had been on the wrong side of that line, and somehow he'd survived, but the cost was this constant vigilance, this inability to trust the road the way he used to. His phone buzzed with a text message, and he pulled it out to find a note from Sergeant Mallory. Just a check-in, asking how he was doing and reminding him about the upcoming trial dates. They'd managed to flip several members of Kinch's organization in exchange for reduced sentences, building a case that the prosecutors said was airtight. Ephraim would have to testify, would have to sit in a courtroom and describe everything that had happened while Kinch stared at him from the defense table, and he wasn't looking forward to it. But it was necessary, was part of making sure they stayed locked up where they couldn't hurt anyone else. He typed back a brief response saying he was fine. Back on the road, everything going well. The lie felt necessary, a small fiction to maintain the appearance that he was recovering normally. After 15 minutes in the rest area, he felt steady enough to continue. The rain had lessened to a drizzle and traffic was picking up as rush hour approached. Both good signs that he'd be able to make it back to the depot without incident. He started the engine and pulled back onto the interstate, merging into the flow of vehicles heading north. The miles clicked past, and Ephraim fell into the rhythm of it. The mechanical process of driving occupying enough of his attention that the anxiety receded to a manageable background hum. He made it back to Terre Haute just after 6 p.m., pulling into the depot yard and backing into his assigned spot with the precision that came from years of practice. The satisfaction of a successful run was muted but present, a small victory that he tried to appreciate. The night dispatcher was someone new, a young guy who processed Ephraim's paperwork efficiently and made small talk about the weather. No mention of what had happened 3 months ago, no awkward questions or pitying looks, just normal interaction between colleagues. Ephraim appreciated that more than he could articulate. He finished up the administrative work, did a quick post-trip inspection of the truck, and headed for his car in the employee lot. The rain had stopped completely now, and the evening air had that fresh-washed quality that came after storms. He sat in his car for a moment before starting it, looking back at the depot with its lights just starting to come on against the gathering dusk, and felt something settle in his chest. He'd done it. He'd gotten back behind the wheel, had completed a run, had proven to himself that he could still do this job. But as he drove home through streets made slick with rain, past intersections where streetlights reflected in puddles and created patterns that looked almost like the detour signs he couldn't stop seeing in his peripheral vision, Ephraim knew that something fundamental had changed. The isolation he'd once found peaceful now felt vulnerable. The empty stretches of highway that used to be meditative now made him hyper-aware of every vehicle that came up behind him. The rain that he'd always considered just another weather condition now carried associations with danger and betrayal. He'd survived, yes, but the version of himself that had left the depot 3 months ago hadn't made it back. That Ephraim was gone, left behind somewhere on a dark road in the rain, and the person driving home now was someone different, harder, warier, carrying knowledge he wished he could unlearn. The next few weeks established a pattern. Ephraim took runs, completed them competently, and returned to base without incident. The company was satisfied with his performance. The psych evaluations showed steady improvement, and on paper, everything looked like a successful recovery. But Ephraim knew better. He was going through the motions, doing what was expected, but the joy he'd once found in the work was gone. Every trip felt like a test he had to pass rather than a job he wanted to do, and the constant vigilance required to manage his anxiety was exhausting in a way that the physical demands of driving had never been. He started to wonder if this was sustainable, if he could keep this up for years, or if eventually the strain would break him completely. The trial date arrived in early June, 6 months after the incident. Ephraim drove to the federal courthouse in Indianapolis, found parking in a garage that cost more per hour than he made, and made his way through security to the courtroom where the prosecution team was waiting. They'd prepped him extensively over the previous weeks, walking him through likely questions and cross-examination strategies, trying to prepare him for seeing Kinch and Corcoran and the others again. But nothing could really prepare you for that moment when you walked into the courtroom and saw the people who'd tried to kill you sitting there in suits and ties looking almost normal, almost like they could be anyone you'd pass on the street without a second glance. The testimony took most of the day. The prosecutor led him through his account methodically, establishing timeline and circumstances, pulling out the details that painted a clear picture of what the hijacking ring had been doing. Ephraim found himself falling into a kind of detached narration, describing events like they'd happened to someone else, and maybe in a way they had. The defense attorneys cross-examined him aggressively, trying to poke holes in his memory and suggest that fear and darkness had made him misinterpret innocent actions, but Ephraim held firm. He knew what he'd seen, what he'd experienced, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change those facts. When he finally stepped down from the witness stand, he felt hollowed out but also oddly lighter, like testifying had been a weight he'd been carrying that he could finally set down. The prosecution told him later that his testimony had been compelling, that combined with the physical evidence and the statements from cooperating witnesses, they were confident of convictions on all major charges. Kinch and Corcoran were looking at decades in federal prison, and the others would serve significant time as well. It was justice, as much as the system could provide, but it didn't undo what had happened. It didn't give Ephraim back the comfort he'd once felt on the road, didn't make the rain less threatening or the darkness less oppressive. Justice and healing weren't the same thing, he was learning, and you could have one without necessarily achieving the other. Summer turned to fall and Ephraim kept driving. The company offered him a desk job, something in logistics or dispatch where he could use his road experience without having to be on the highway himself, but he turned it down. Accepting that felt like admitting defeat, like letting Kinch win even from behind bars, and he wasn't ready to do that. So he kept taking runs, kept pushing through the anxiety and the hypervigilance, kept telling himself that eventually it would get easier. Some days were better than others. Clear weather helped, daylight runs were manageable, and routes he'd driven dozens of times before the incident felt almost normal. But rainy nights were still difficult, and any unexpected detour or road closure could send him spiraling into barely controlled panic. October brought another storm system, this one tracking across the Midwest and dumping rain for 3 straight days. Ephraim had a run scheduled to Cincinnati, a route that would take him through areas that could flood in heavy rain, and he seriously considered calling in sick. But the company was short-handed, and the load was time-sensitive medical supplies, and in the end, he couldn't bring himself to let someone else take the risk. He did his pre-trip inspection in the depot yard while rain hammered down, checked his phone for weather updates and road conditions, and finally pulled out just after midnight when traffic would be lightest. The familiar anxiety was there, but he'd learned to work with it rather than fighting it, acknowledging the fear while not letting it control his actions. The drive down was tense but uneventful. The highway mostly clear despite the conditions. Ephraim delivered his load at the Cincinnati distribution center just after dawn, grabbed coffee and a breakfast sandwich at a truck stop, and started the return trip as the rain intensified again. He was making decent time despite the weather, keeping his speed down and his following distance generous, when he saw the signs. Not detour signs, construction warnings for lane closures ahead due to water over the road. legitimate highway department signage with proper formatting and official markers, and he could see the flashing lights of actual road crew vehicles managing traffic up ahead. This was real, normal, exactly the kind of thing that happened on highways during storms. But his heart rate spiked anyway, and his hands tightened on the wheel, and he had to talk himself through it. The road crew funneled traffic into a single lane, one of them standing in the rain with a slow-stop paddle directing vehicles around the flooded section. Ephraim rolled past slowly, nodding thanks to the worker who nodded back, and then he was through and the highway opened up again. Just construction, just normal road maintenance, nothing sinister or threatening. But his hands were shaking again, and he realized he was crying, tears running down his face that he didn't remember starting. He pulled off at the next exit and found a parking lot where he could stop and fall apart for a few minutes. The sobs came hard and fast, releasing tension he'd been holding for months, and when they finally subsided, he felt wrung out but somehow cleaner, like something toxic had been purged from his system. He sat there in the cab while rain continued to fall around him, watching it run down the windshield in streams and rivulets that caught the gray morning light. Eventually, he pulled out his phone and opened his contacts, scrolling to a number he'd been avoiding since the hospital had given it to him. A therapist who specialized in trauma, someone Sergeant Mallory had recommended when she'd noticed Ephraim struggling during trial prep. He told himself he didn't need it, that he could manage on his own, but sitting here in this parking lot crying over construction signs made it clear that he couldn't. He wasn't managing, he was barely surviving, and if he kept pretending otherwise, he was going to end up hurt or dead or causing someone else to get hurt. He pressed call before he could talk himself out of it. The intake appointment was scheduled for the following week, and Ephraim kept it. The therapist was a middle-aged woman named Dr. Reeves, who listened without judgment as he described the incident and its aftermath, who helped him understand that what he was experiencing was normal given the circumstances, and who gave him tools for managing the anxiety when it threatened to overwhelm him. It wasn't a magic solution. Nothing was going to instantly make the trauma disappear, but it was a start. He began going regularly, working through the fear and the hypervigilance and the way his brain had learned to see threats everywhere, slowly rewiring those automatic responses into something more functional. Winter came, and with it, different challenges. Ice instead of rain, reduced visibility from snow, the constant vigilance required to maintain control on slippery roads. But Ephraim found that he was handling it better, that the coping strategies he'd learned in therapy were actually helping. He could distinguish real danger from perceived threat, could talk himself through panic responses before they escalated, could function on the road without constantly being on the edge of breakdown. He'd never get back to where he'd been before. That version of himself was gone permanently, but maybe he could build something new, something that incorporated the experience without being destroyed by it. The following spring, almost a year after the incident, Ephraim took a run that brought him back through the area where it had happened. He hadn't been avoiding it exactly, but he hadn't gone out of his way to drive those roads either. Now, with a load headed for Paducah, he found himself approaching that same stretch of highway where the detour signs had first appeared. His hands tensed on the wheel, and he felt the familiar spike of anxiety, but this time he had tools to manage it. He focused on his breathing, grounded himself in the present moment, reminded himself that the signs were gone, the people responsible were in prison, and he was safe. The mile markers ticked past, 45, 46, 47, and he kept driving. He didn't stop at the site, didn't slow down or try to mark the spot where his life had changed. There was nothing there to see anyway, just highway and trees and the ordinary landscape of rural Kentucky. The detour signs had been removed, the abandoned truck stop had been shut down and secured, and there was no visible evidence that anything had ever happened here. But Ephraim knew, would always know, and that knowledge had become part of him in ways both terrible and transformative. He'd learned things about the world and about himself that he wished he could unlearn, but he'd also discovered reserves of strength and resilience he hadn't known he possessed. The experience had broken something in him, yes, but it had also revealed what was underneath that breaking, a core that could bend without snapping completely. He completed the Paducah run without incident and returned to base as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him why he'd gotten into trucking in the first place: the freedom of the road, the ever-changing landscape, the simple satisfaction of picking up a load and delivering it where it needed to go. Those things were still there, still valid, even if they were now colored by experience and tempered by hard-won wisdom. Ephraim backed his rig into its spot, secured everything properly, and did his final paperwork. The night dispatcher asked if he had any issues to report, and Ephraim said no, everything was fine, which was both true and not true, in ways that were too complicated to explain in a casual conversation. He walked to his car in the gathering darkness, keys in hand, and paused before getting in. Somewhere out on the highways, other drivers were rolling through the night, making deliveries, hauling commerce across the country, living the life he'd chosen and still chose despite everything. Some of them would have easy runs. Some would face weather or mechanical issues or the normal challenges of the job. And a few, a very few, might encounter something worse, might find themselves detoured onto dark roads by people with bad intentions, might have to fight and run and survive, and then try to put their lives back together afterward. Ephraim thought about them, these hypothetical drivers he'd never meet, and he hoped they'd be luckier than he'd been. Hoped they'd never have to learn what he'd learned about how the world worked in its darkest corners. But if they did, if they found themselves in that nightmare situation, he hoped they'd remember that survival was possible, that you could make it through horror and come out the other side changed but intact, that the road could be dangerous, but it could also lead you home if you just kept moving forward no matter how scared you were. Ephraim got in his car and drove through streets that had dried since the last rain, past intersections that no longer made his pulse race, and when he finally pulled into his driveway and shut off the engine, he sat there for a moment in the quiet. The nightmares would probably never completely stop. The hypervigilance would always be there to some degree. The rain would always carry associations he wished it didn't. But he was still here, still driving, still surviving, still fighting to reclaim the life that Kinch and his people had tried to take. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered, not letting them win, not letting fear make him into someone who couldn't do the work he loved. He got out of the car, locked it, and walked to his front door with the evening air cool against his face, and the sound of distant traffic a reminder that the world kept turning regardless of individual trauma. Tomorrow he'd have another run, another chance to prove to himself that he could handle it, and the day after that another one. One trip at a time, 1 mile at a time. Rebuilding a life, one delivery at a time, until someday the good memories might outweigh the bad ones. Inside his apartment, he made dinner, watched some television, and eventually went to bed. Sleep came easier now than it had in the months immediately after the incident, the therapy and time doing their slow work of healing. And when he dreamed that night, for once, it wasn't about running through dark woods or being trapped in a trailer. Instead, he dreamed about highways stretching to the horizon under clear skies, about the steady vibration of a diesel engine and the satisfaction of a load delivered on time. Simple dreams, peaceful dreams, and when he woke the next morning to his alarm, he felt something that had been absent for a long time. Anticipation rather than dread for the day ahead. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it was enough. It was a start. The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight by the time Hobart Quillen started seriously considering whether he should pull off the road. He'd been driving since late afternoon with a load of furniture destined for a warehouse in Tulsa, and what had started as a routine run through Oklahoma back roads had turned into something more challenging as the storm system settled in and refused to move. The Weather Service had upgraded their warnings twice in the past hour, talking about flash flood potential and reduced visibility, but Hobart had driven through worse, and he was only about 90 miles from his destination. Close enough that stopping felt like admitting defeat, far enough that pushing through in deteriorating conditions was starting to look like poor judgment. The windshield wipers were on their highest setting and still barely keeping up, the rain coming down so hard it sounded like gravel being thrown against the cab. The highway he'd been following had narrowed about 20 miles back, transitioning from a proper 2-lane state route to something that felt more like a farm road that happened to have painted lines. The GPS insisted this was the correct path, the most direct route to Tulsa from where he'd started, but Hobart was starting to have doubts. There were no other vehicles visible in either direction, no houses or businesses along the roadside, just endless stretches of flat Oklahoma grassland that disappeared into the rain and darkness. His headlights cut through the downpour in weak cones that illuminated maybe 30 feet of road before everything dissolved into sheets of water. The white line on the shoulder was his only real reference point, and even that kept disappearing under standing water that had nowhere to drain in the flat terrain. A sign appeared in his headlights, weathered and barely legible, but marking an exit for something called Dry Creek. The irony of the name wasn't lost on Hobart as he watched water cascade across the road in waves that suggested the creek in question was anything but dry at the moment. He was debating whether to take the exit when his phone buzzed with an alert. Flash flood warning for this county, immediate action recommended, avoid low-lying areas, and do not attempt to cross flooded roads. The timing felt like the universe making the decision for him. He couldn't keep pushing through conditions that were actively dangerous, and if there was any kind of town or truck stop at this exit, it would be smarter to hole up for a few hours and wait out the worst of the storm. The furniture in his trailer wasn't perishable, and his delivery window had enough padding that a few hours' delay wouldn't cause problems. He took the exit, the ramp curving away from the highway and descending slightly into what felt like even heavier rain, if that was possible. The road here was in worse shape than the highway, pocked with potholes that had filled with water and created dark mirrors that reflected his headlights in disorienting patterns. There were no streetlights, no signs of habitation, just the narrow road winding through darkness and rain. Hobart was starting to think he'd made a mistake when buildings appeared ahead, or rather the suggestion of buildings, dark shapes barely visible through the downpour. He slowed to a crawl, trying to make out details, and gradually resolved what he was seeing into a small cluster of structures that might charitably be called a town. A closed gas station with boarded windows, a few houses with no lights on, and off to the right down a gravel drive, a long low building with a neon sign that flickered weakly through the rain. The sign read Dry Creek Motel in faded red letters, with a smaller vacancy sign beneath it that buzzed and sputtered but stayed lit. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and right now that was all Hobart needed. He turned onto the gravel drive, the truck's suspension protesting as the wheels dropped into ruts that had turned into small streams. The motel was classic mid-century roadside architecture, a single-story L-shaped building with maybe a dozen rooms, each with a numbered door painted in what had once been turquoise but had faded to an indeterminate gray-green. The office was at the near end, identifiable by a larger window and another small neon sign that said Office in flickering blue. There was a covered awning that extended out over the parking area in front of the office, and Hobart maneuvered the rig to park as close to it as possible, though there was no way to get the entire truck under cover. He shut off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the rain hammer on the cab roof and watching water sheet off the windshield now that the wipers had stopped. The parking lot was empty, except for an old sedan parked near the far end of the building, so covered in mud and road grime that its original color was impossible to determine. No other trucks, no other guests visible, which wasn't surprising given the location and the weather. Hobart pulled on his rain jacket, grabbed his wallet and phone, and pushed open the door. The rain hit him like a physical blow, cold and hard, and he was soaked through despite the jacket before he'd taken 3 steps. He jogged to the office door and pushed it open, a small bell jingling overhead to announce his arrival. The office was dim and stuffy, lit by a single fluorescent tube that buzzed and flickered in rhythm with the neon signs outside. The air had that particular smell of old motels, mildew and cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener fighting a losing battle against accumulated decades of neglect. A counter ran along the back wall with a register and a rack of keys hanging on hooks, each key attached to a plastic diamond-shaped tag with a room number. Behind the counter, a doorway led to what was presumably the manager's quarters, a curtain pulled partially across but not enough to hide the blue glow of a television. Hobart cleared his throat, and after a moment he heard movement from the back room, then footsteps, and finally a woman emerged through the curtain. She was somewhere in her 50s, thin in a way that suggested hardship rather than health, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a loose ponytail and the kind of lined face that came from too much sun and too many cigarettes. She was wearing a cardigan over a faded house dress despite the warmth of the office, and she studied Hobart with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, just vaguely assessing. "Help you?" she said, her voice carrying the flat vowels of rural Oklahoma, and Hobart nodded toward the window where rain was visible cascading off the awning. "Need a room for the night," he said. "Maybe just a few hours if this storm passes. Got a truck parked out front, hope that's not a problem." The woman, Odessa, according to the tarnished nameplate on the counter, shook her head. "No problem. Rooms are $40 a night, cash preferred, but I can run a card if that's all you got." She pulled a registration book from under the counter, an actual physical ledger rather than a computer, and slid it toward him along with a pen. The book was old, its pages yellowed and warped from humidity, and Hobart could see previous entries in various hands, some recent and some that looked years old. He filled in his information, name, license plate, truck number, while Odessa watched with that same neutral expression. When he finished, she took the book back and studied his entry, then turned to the key rack and selected one. "Room 7, she said, sliding the key across the counter. "End of the row, away from the office. Quieter there." Hobart took the key. Its plastic tag cracked and yellowed with age, and was turning to leave when Odessa spoke again. "Storm's supposed to get worse before it gets better. Radio said creeks are already over their banks in some places. You might be here longer than a few hours." There was something in the way she said it that made Hobart pause, an inflection he couldn't quite parse. Warning? Satisfaction? He couldn't tell. "That's fine," he said. "Better to wait it out safe than end up stuck on a flooded road." Odessa nodded slowly, her eyes not quite meeting his. "Sure. Better safe. Anything you need. Office is open all night, usually." She turned away before he could ask what "usually" meant, disappearing back through the curtain to her television, and Hobart was left standing in the empty office with the buzzing fluorescent and the rain sound and a growing sense that something about this situation felt off. He shook off the feeling and headed back out into the rain, jogging to his truck to grab his overnight bag from the cab. Room 7 was at the far end of the building, the last door before the L-shape turned the corner, and Hobart had to wade through ankle-deep water that had pooled in the low spots of the gravel lot to reach it. The key stuck in the lock, and he had to jiggle it several times before the mechanism turned. the door finally swinging open with a creak that suggested hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. He fumbled for the light switch, and fluorescent tubes flickered to life overhead, revealing a room that matched his expectations based on the exterior. Cheap paneling on the walls, a double bed with a sagging mattress and a bedspread that had probably been installed when the motel was new in the 1960s, a television on a rickety stand, and a door that led to what he assumed was the bathroom. The room smelled stale and unused, like it had been closed up for a while, and there was a faint odor of damp that suggested water had gotten in at some point. Hobart checked the bathroom and found a small space with a toilet, sink, and shower stall, all in avocado green that confirmed his guess about the age of the place. The plumbing groaned when he turned on the tap, but water came out eventually, rust-colored at first, then clearing to something that looked drinkable if not appetizing. He splashed some on his face, trying to wash away the road grime and the lingering unease that had settled over him since entering the office. It was just a rundown motel in the middle of nowhere, nothing sinister about it, just unfortunate and poorly maintained. He'd stayed in worse places over the years. He went back into the main room and sat on the edge of the bed, pulling out his phone to check messages and weather updates. The cell signal was weak, barely 1 bar, but it was enough to load a radar map that showed the storm system sprawled across most of Oklahoma with no signs of moving. The heavy rain would continue for at least another 6 hours, possibly longer, which meant Hobart was stuck here until morning at minimum. He sent a quick message to his dispatcher explaining the situation and his revised arrival time, then set his phone on the nightstand and tried to decide if he wanted to attempt sleep or just wait out the storm. The bed didn't look inviting, and he wasn't particularly tired, just restless in the way that came from too many hours behind the wheel, followed by forced inactivity. A sound from outside caught his attention. Footsteps on gravel, someone moving past his window. Hobart crossed to the curtain and pulled it back slightly, peering out into the rain-soaked parking lot. A figure was walking along the row of rooms, hunched against the rain, moving from door to door. As Hobart watched, the figure stopped at room 4 and tried the door handle. Finding it locked, they moved to room 5 and repeated the action. They were checking doors, testing to see which rooms were occupied or which were unlocked, and the deliberate, systematic nature of it made Hobart's instincts flare. He let the curtain fall back into place and moved to his door, making sure the deadbolt was engaged and the chain lock was secured. The doorknob rattled slightly as someone tried it from outside, found it locked, and moved on. Hobart waited by the door, listening, and heard the footsteps continue past his room toward the corner where the building turned. Then silence except for the rain. He counted to 30 before going back to the window and looking out again, but the parking lot was empty now, the figure gone. Just someone checking for an open room, maybe, or a guest who'd forgotten which room was theirs. Reasonable explanations existed. But combined with Odessa's odd manner and the general atmosphere of this place, Hobart's unease was growing into something harder to dismiss. He checked his phone again, still only 1 bar, and now he noticed something he'd missed before. There was no Wi-Fi signal, which wasn't unusual for a budget motel, but more concerning was that when he tried to pull up anything beyond the weather radar, nothing would load. His data connection was essentially non-functional despite the signal bar showing. He tried calling his dispatcher, but the call failed to connect. Just an error message about network unavailability. Then he tried 911, just to test, and got the same result. His phone was showing a signal but couldn't actually communicate with anything. Either the storm was interfering with the cell towers, or something else was blocking the connection, and Hobart wasn't sure which possibility worried him more. He was effectively cut off here, isolated in a rundown motel with no way to call for help if something went wrong. The smart thing would be to get back in his truck and leave, storm or no storm. But looking out the window at the sheets of rain and the water already standing several inches deep in the parking lot, he wasn't sure that was actually safer. Driving in these conditions could be suicidal, especially on roads he didn't know that might already be flooded out. He was weighing his options when he heard voices outside, muffled by the rain but clearly coming from nearby. Hobart moved back to the window and looked out to see two figures standing under the awning near the office, lit by the wan glow of the neon signs. One was Odessa, still in her cardigan despite the weather, and the other was a man in a county jacket, the kind that utility workers or minor officials wore. They were deep in conversation, both gesturing toward the motel building, and something about their body language suggested disagreement, or at least tension. Hobart couldn't make out what they were saying, but he could see Odessa shaking her head emphatically at something the man was insisting on. The conversation lasted another minute before the man threw up his hands in apparent frustration and walked away, heading toward a pickup truck that Hobart hadn't noticed before, parked on the far side of the sedan. The truck started up and pulled out of the lot, its taillights disappearing into the rain, and Odessa stood watching it go before turning and walking back into the office. The whole interaction had taken maybe 5 minutes, but it left Hobart with more questions than answers. Who was the man? What were they arguing about? And why did the whole thing feel like he'd witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see? He let the curtain fall back and sat down on the bed again, his mind working through possibilities. County official checking on the motel's safety during the storm, someone Odessa knew personally, or something else, something related to the figure checking doors and the odd atmosphere that seemed to permeate this place. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to trust his instincts and get out of here. But where would he go? The highway was barely passable when he'd left it, and that was an hour ago when conditions were better. The storm was intensifying, not letting up, and heading back out into it could be more dangerous than staying put. Hobart had spent 20 years driving trucks, had developed good instincts about when to push through and when to wait, and right now those instincts were giving him conflicting signals. Danger here, danger out there, no clear safe option. He compromised by deciding to stay but remain alert, to treat this like a potentially hostile situation rather than just an unfortunate overnight stop. He moved his bag to block the door partially, creating a barrier that would slow anyone trying to enter, and positioned a chair where he could sit and watch both the door and the window. The hours crawled past with painful slowness. Hobart dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. The rain changing tempo, the building settling, a door slamming somewhere in the complex. Around 2 a.m, he heard an engine start up and looked out to see the muddy sedan pulling out of its parking spot and driving away into the rain. So, someone else had been staying here, though he'd never seen them enter or leave their room. The sedan's departure left the parking lot empty except for his rig, which somehow made him feel more isolated rather than less. He was alone here now with just Odessa in the office, assuming she was still there, and whoever or whatever had been checking doors earlier. The rain finally began to let up around 4 a.m., transitioning from the heavy downpour to a steady drizzle. Hobart stood by the window watching the sky lighten fractionally toward dawn, gray replacing black but bringing no real comfort. The parking lot was a disaster, gravel washed away in places to reveal bare dirt that had turned to mud, and water still pooled everywhere, creating an obstacle course between his truck and the office. He needed to check out, needed to get back on the road now that conditions were improving, but something made him hesitate. The normal procedure would be to return the key to the office, but the thought of going back into that dim, stuffy room with Odessa's assessing eyes and the general wrongness of the place made his skin crawl. He could just leave the key in the room and go, but that felt like leaving loose ends. He was still debating when he heard the sound of another vehicle approaching, tires splashing through water. Hobart moved to the window and saw a county vehicle pulling into the lot, some kind of official truck with a light bar on top. The truck parked near the office and a man got out. Not the same one from earlier. This one was older and moved with the deliberate bearing of someone in authority. He was wearing a uniform, county storm warden according to the patches visible on his jacket, and he headed directly to the office door without looking around. Hobart watched as the man disappeared inside, then moments later emerged with Odessa, both of them standing under the awning in what looked like another tense conversation. This time, Hobart could make out fragments over the diminishing rain. The man, Ferris Blaine, he would later learn, was saying something about protocols and evacuation orders and unregistered guests. Odessa was arguing back, her voice rising enough to carry, insisting that everything was in order and she had every right to keep the motel open. Blaine was shaking his head, pointing at something Hobart couldn't see, maybe a clipboard or official documents. The argument continued for several minutes, neither party willing to give ground, and Hobart realized that whatever was happening here was bigger than just a rundown motel staying open during a storm. There was history here, conflict between Odessa and local authorities, and he'd stumbled into the middle of it. The conversation ended with Blaine getting back in his truck and leaving, though his body language suggested this wasn't over. Odessa stood under the awning watching him go, and then her head turned and she looked directly at room 7, directly at the window where Hobart stood. For a moment, their eyes met through the rain-streaked glass, and Hobart saw something in her expression that sent ice down his spine. Not anger or fear, but something calculating. Something that suggested she'd known all along that he was watching. Then she smiled, a small, tight expression that didn't reach her eyes, and turned back to the office. Hobart let the curtain fall and stepped back from the window, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He needed to leave. He needed to leave right now. Whatever was happening at the Dry Creek Motel, he wanted no part of it. Hobart moved quickly but deliberately, gathering his belongings and stuffing them into his overnight bag with hands that wanted to shake, but that he forced to remain steady. Years of trucking had taught him that panic was worse than almost any actual danger, that keeping your head clear and your movements purposeful was how you survived unexpected situations. He did a final sweep of the room to make sure he hadn't left anything behind. Wallet, phone, keys, all accounted for, and then approached the door. His hand was on the deadbolt when he paused, listening. The rain had diminished to a light patter now, and beneath it he could hear something else, footsteps on gravel, moving along the front of the motel building, coming closer to room 7. He stepped back from the door and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see out without being obvious about it. Odessa was walking along the row of rooms, moving with purpose despite the mud and standing water, and she was carrying something. As she got closer, Hobart could make out what it was. A key ring, heavy with multiple keys, and she was stopping at each door to peer in the windows before moving to the next. She was checking the rooms, making sure they were actually empty or occupied, and Hobart realized with cold certainty that she was working her way toward him. He had maybe 2 minutes before she reached room 7, maybe less, and his truck was parked 30 feet away across a parking lot that had turned into a muddy obstacle course. The smart play would be to confront her directly, to open the door and say he was checking out and thanks for the room, and just walk past her to his truck like everything was normal. But every instinct was screaming that engaging with Odessa right now would be a mistake. That whatever was happening at this motel required avoiding interaction rather than seeking it. Hobart made his decision. He grabbed his bag, unlocked the door as quietly as possible, and slipped out while Odessa was still 3 rooms away with her back partially turned. The rain immediately soaked him, but he ignored it, moving quickly toward his truck while trying not to splash too obviously through the puddles. He was halfway there when he heard Odessa's voice cutting through the morning air. "Checking out already?" She'd turned around faster than he'd expected, was standing in front of room 5, watching him with that same neutral expression. Storm's letting up, but the roads are still bad. Might want to wait another hour or two. There was something in her tone that made it sound less like advice and more like a command, and Hobart felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He forced himself to turn and face her, to keep his expression casual despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Yeah, got a delivery window to make," he called back, raising his voice over the rain. "Thanks for the room, though. Keys on the dresser." He turned back to his truck without waiting for a response, climbing up into the cab and pulling the door shut behind him with more force than necessary. His hands were shaking now as he fumbled the key into the ignition, and he had to take a breath to steady himself before turning it. The diesel engine coughed once, twice, and for a horrifying moment he thought it wasn't going to start. Then it caught and rumbled to life, and relief flooded through him so intensely it was almost painful. He put the truck in gear and started to pull forward, and that's when he saw Odessa moving. She wasn't walking anymore, she was running, cutting across the parking lot at an angle that would intercept him before he could reach the exit. Her expression had changed from neutral to something harder, more determined, and she was shouting something he couldn't make out over the engine noise. Hobart accelerated, the truck's tires spinning in the mud before finding purchase, and he aimed for the gravel drive that led back to the main road. Odessa reached the edge of the parking lot and stopped, still shouting, and now Hobart could see she was waving her arms in a stopping motion. He ignored her and kept going, the truck bouncing over ruts and through standing water, and then he was on the gravel drive headed away from the motel. In his mirrors, he could see Odessa standing in the parking lot watching him go, and then she turned and ran back toward the office. Going for a phone, maybe, or something else, and Hobart didn't want to think too hard about what that something else might be. The gravel drive was worse than he remembered from last night, washed out in places and slick with mud, and twice the truck fishtailed slightly before he got it back under control. But then he was reaching the main road, such as it was, and turning back toward where he thought the highway would be. The road was partially flooded, water running across it in sheets that made it hard to distinguish the pavement from the shoulders, but Hobart had driven through worse, and he kept his speed reasonable and his eyes scanning for hazards. A mile from the motel, he passed the county storm warden's truck, parked on the shoulder with its lights on, and he caught a glimpse of Ferris Blaine standing beside it looking at something on a clipboard. Blaine looked up as Hobart passed, and their eyes met for a moment, and Hobart saw what looked like surprise on the warden's face before the truck was passed and the moment was gone. He kept driving, putting distance between himself and Dry Creek, and gradually his heart rate began to slow towards something approaching normal. The rain had almost stopped now, just a light mist hanging in the air, and the sky was lightening properly as dawn broke over the flat Oklahoma landscape. Hobart's phone suddenly buzzed with a series of delayed notifications, all arriving at once, and he realized he had signal again. Real signal that actually worked. He pulled over at the first wide spot he could find and sat there for a moment, engine idling, while he checked his messages. Several from his dispatcher asking for updates, a weather alert that was now outdated, and a voicemail from a number he didn't recognize. He played the voicemail and heard Ferris Blaine's voice. "This message is for Hobart Quillen, if you're the trucker who stopped at the Dry Creek Motel last night. This is Ferris Blaine, County Storm Warden. I need you to call me back as soon as you get this message. It's important, and it concerns your safety. The number is..." Hobart listened to the rest of the message, saved the number, and sat staring at his phone trying to decide what to do. Part of him wanted to just delete the message and keep driving, to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever was happening back there. But another part, the part that had survived 20 years of trucking by paying attention to warning signs and not ignoring problems, knew that wasn't smart. If there was something dangerous about the motel, something official enough that the county storm warden was involved. He needed to know what it was. He called the number. Blaine answered on the second ring. "Ferris Blaine." His voice was clipped and professional, but Hobart could hear tension underneath it. "This is Hobart Quillen. I got your message. What's this about?" There was a pause, and Hobart heard what sounded like papers rustling. "Mr. Quillen, I need to know if you stayed at the Dry Creek Motel last night, and if so, which room you were in." Hobart's grip tightened on the phone. "Room 7. Why? What's going on?" Another pause, longer this time, and when Blaine spoke again, his voice had shifted to something more cautious. "How long were you there? Did you interact with anyone besides the manager? Did you notice anything unusual about the property?" The questions came rapid fire, and Hobart answered them as best he could, describing his arrival around midnight, his interactions with Odessa, the figure checking door handles, the conversations he'd witnessed between Odessa and officials. Blaine listened without interrupting, and Hobart could hear him taking notes. When Hobart finished, there was a long silence before Blaine spoke again. "Mr. Quillen, I need you to come back to Dry Creek. I know that's probably the last thing you want to do, but I need a statement from you, and there are some things you need to see. Things that will explain why I've been trying to get that motel shut down for the past 6 months." The words sent ice down Hobart's spine. "What kind of things?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Blaine's voice was grim. "The kind that mean you were very lucky to leave when you did. Can you meet me at the motel in 30 minutes? I'll have county deputies there for safety. You won't be at risk. But your testimony about what you witnessed last night could be the final piece I need to get an emergency closure order." Hobart wanted to say no, wanted to tell Blaine he was already back on the highway and wouldn't be stopping for anything. But the thought of other drivers pulling off that exit, checking into that motel, ending up in whatever situation he'd barely escaped from, made the decision for him. 30 minutes, he agreed, and ended the call before he could change his mind. The drive back to Dry Creek felt longer than the drive away had. Every mile marker a reminder that he was voluntarily returning to a place his instincts were screaming to avoid. But he kept going, and eventually the exit appeared and he took it, following the familiar road back toward the cluster of buildings that marked the town. The motel looked different in daylight, not less ominous exactly, but more obviously dilapidated, a relic from another era that was slowly collapsing under the weight of time and neglect. There were now 3 county vehicles parked in the lot, including Blaine's truck and 2 sheriff's department cruisers, and Hobart could see several uniformed figures moving around the property. He parked his rig near the entrance and climbed down to find Blaine walking toward him. Up close, Ferris Blaine was a man in his late 50s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his life working outdoors. He was wearing the same county jacket from earlier, now mud-splattered, and he extended a hand as he approached. "Mr. Quillen, thanks for coming back. I know this probably feels wrong." Hobart shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke to manual labor. "You could say that. What's going on here that's got county resources mobilized at dawn?" Blaine gestured toward the motel building. "Let me show you. But I should warn you, it's not pleasant." They walked toward the row of rooms, passing the office where Hobart could see Odessa sitting in one of the cruisers, her hands apparently restrained. She saw him, and her expression shifted to something between anger and what might have been desperation, and she started saying something that was muffled by the car windows. Blaine kept walking, and Hobart followed, trying not to look at Odessa, trying not to think about how close he'd come to whatever fate she'd apparently had planned. They stopped at room 4, several doors down from where Hobart had stayed, and Blaine pushed open the door that was already ajar. "This is what I wanted you to see," he said quietly. This is why I've been fighting to close this place down. The room looked similar to room 7 at first glance. Same paneling, same dated furniture, same general layout, but there were differences that made Hobart's stomach turn. The bed was stripped down to a bare mattress that was stained dark with something that might have been water damage, or might have been something worse. The walls had marks on them, scratches and dents that looked like someone had struggled there. And most disturbing was the floor near the bathroom door, where the carpet had been pulled up to reveal concrete underneath that showed dark stains, even after what must have been attempts to clean it. Blaine watched Hobart's face as he took it all in. "We've had 4 missing persons reports filed over the past 2 years, Blaine said, his voice flat. All of them were last seen in this area during storms. All of them were driving trucks or commercial vehicles. The implications crashed over Hobart like a physical wave. You think she was—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't quite bring himself to say it out loud. Blaine nodded grimly. "We think she was targeting truckers who stopped here for shelter during bad weather, drugging them, robbing them, and disposing of the evidence. We haven't found bodies yet, but the forensic team is bringing in ground-penetrating radar to check the property. Your statement about the figure checking door handles, about the arguments I had with her over operating during storms, it all fits the pattern we've been documenting." He paused, then added more quietly, "You left just in time. I think if you'd stayed another hour, you would have been next." Hobart felt his legs go weak and he had to lean against the doorframe for support. He thought about the key Odessa had been carrying, about her checking rooms, about the calculating look she'd given him through the window, about how he'd been alone in room 7 at the far end of the building where no one would hear if something happened. "But the other guest," he heard himself saying. "I saw a car leave around 2 a.m. There was someone else here." Blaine's expression darkened. "The sedan that was parked here when you arrived. We found it abandoned about 5 miles down the highway, driver's door open, no sign of whoever was operating it. We're treating it as another missing person case until we can confirm otherwise." They moved through several other rooms, each one showing signs of the same disturbing activities. Stripped beds, pulled up carpet, evidence of cleaning that hadn't quite erased the stains underneath. In room 9 they found a collection of personal items that had apparently been taken from previous victims. Wallets, phones, keys, things that could be sold or used. A deputy was carefully documenting each item, photographing and bagging them as evidence. Hobart recognized a couple of the wallets as the type that truck drivers favored, heavy leather with chains to attach to belt loops, and the sight made him feel sick. These were colleagues, people who'd made the same decision he had to seek shelter during a storm, and they'd paid for it with their lives. Blaine walked Hobart back towards the office area where other deputies were processing the crime scene. "I need you to give a formal statement," Blaine said. "Everything you saw and heard from the time you arrived until you left. Times, descriptions, exact words if you can remember them. It'll take a couple of hours, but it's crucial for building a case against her." Hobart nodded, still processing everything he'd learned. "What about the other people I saw arguing with her? The guy in the county jacket who was here before you arrived?" Blaine's expression shifted to something uncomfortable. "That's part of what's complicated this case. Odessa had connections with county workers, people who owed her favors, or who she had leverage over. Not law enforcement, but maintenance workers, clerks, people who could alert her when we were planning inspections, or who could delay paperwork. It's why it's taken us so long to build a case. She had warning every time we tried to make a move." They set up in one of the county vehicles where Hobart spent the next 3 hours giving his statement to a detective who'd arrived from the county seat. He described everything in as much detail as he could remember. Odessa's mannerisms, the layout of room 7, the sound of footsteps checking doors, the conversations he'd witnessed, the way his phone had shown signal but couldn't connect, That last detail got particular attention from the detective. "We found a signal jammer in the office," the detective explained. "Commercial grade, the kind that creates a dead zone about 100 yards in diameter. Shows signal strength on your phone, but blocks actual communication. It's illegal to operate one, but it would explain why you couldn't call out." The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture of a predator who'd spent years perfecting her hunting ground. The isolated location, the storms that brought in desperate travelers, the jammer that cut off their ability to call for help, the systematic way she'd check which rooms were occupied before making her move. Hobart had been prey in a trap he hadn't even recognized as such, saved only by instinct and the random chance of leaving when he did. The thought of how close he'd come, of how easily he could have been another missing trucker whose fate was never discovered, made him feel cold despite the warming morning air. By the time Hobart finished his statement, it was nearly noon, and the motel property was swarming with additional law enforcement and forensic personnel. A news van had arrived from Tulsa, parked at the edge of the lot, and reporters were trying to get statements from anyone who talked to them. Blaine found Hobart sitting in his truck cab, staring at nothing, and climbed up on the running board to look in the window. "How you holding up?" the warden asked, and Hobart had to think about the answer. How was he holding up? He'd spent the night in a room that might have been the last place multiple people had been alive. He'd been minutes away from becoming a victim himself. He'd witnessed the end of what was apparently a multi-year killing spree. "I don't know," he finally said, and that was the most honest answer he could give. Blaine nodded like he understood. "You should probably talk to someone. County has victim services, counselors who specialize in this kind of thing. I can give you contact information." He paused, then added, "For what it's worth, you did everything right. Trusted your instincts, got out when something felt wrong, came back when it mattered. A lot of people wouldn't have had the presence of mind to do that." Hobart wanted to say something about how he hadn't done anything special, had just gotten lucky, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just nodded and accepted the business card Blaine handed him. "I need to get back on the road," he heard himself saying. "I've got a delivery that's already late, and sitting here isn't helping anything." Blaine looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to insist that Hobart shouldn't drive in his current state, but after a moment, he just stepped back and let Hobart close the door. "Take care of yourself," Blaine called through the window. "And maybe stick to highways for a while. Give yourself time to process this before taking any more back-road shortcuts." It was good advice, and Hobart nodded his acceptance of it, but he knew it wasn't that simple. Every highway had exits, every exit led somewhere, and there was no way to know which ones were safe and which ones led to places like Dry Creek Motel. The illusion of safety that came from major routes was just that, an illusion. Predators existed in the margins, in the overlooked places where storms forced travelers off the main roads, and avoiding one didn't mean you wouldn't find another. He started the engine and pulled out of the lot, watching the motel shrink in his mirrors until it disappeared around a curve. The morning had turned clear and bright, the storm system finally moving off to the east, and the landscape looked clean and fresh in a way that felt dishonest given what he now knew had been happening in that forgotten corner of Oklahoma. He drove in silence, not turning on the radio or CB, just listening to the sound of the engine and the road and trying to organize his thoughts into something coherent. The delivery to Tulsa could wait another few hours. His dispatcher would understand, especially once Hobart explained what had happened. Right now, he just needed to drive, needed the familiar comfort of the road and the rig, and the simple mechanical task of getting from one place to another. Somewhere around the state line, he pulled into a proper truck stop, one of the national chains with multiple pumps and a full restaurant and plenty of other drivers visible. The normalcy of it was almost overwhelming after the isolation of Dry Creek, and Hobart found himself just sitting in the parking lot for 15 minutes watching people come and go. Families on road trips, other truckers grabbing coffee and food, employees changing shifts, all the ordinary human activity that made up the background of highway life. Eventually, he climbed down and went inside, ordered coffee he didn't really want, and sat in a booth trying to look like just another driver on just another run. An older trucker at the next booth over caught his eye and nodded, that universal trucker acknowledgement of shared profession, and Hobart nodded back. The simple gesture felt grounding somehow, a reminder that most of the people on these roads were just doing their jobs, not hunting prey in broken-down motels. His phone rang, and he saw it was his dispatcher. He answered and spent 10 minutes explaining the situation in broad strokes, leaving out some of the more disturbing details, but conveying enough that the dispatcher understood why he was running late. To their credit, the dispatcher was more concerned about Hobart's well-being than the delayed load. "Take whatever time you need," they said. "We'll handle the customer, explain the circumstances. You just take care of yourself and let us know when you're ready to resume the run." It was the response Hobart had hoped for, but hadn't quite expected, and he felt something loosen in his chest. He confirmed he'd be back on the road within an hour and ended the call, then sat staring at his coffee while it slowly cooled. A TV mounted in the corner of the restaurant was showing local news, and as Hobart watched, a breaking news banner appeared. "Arrest in connection with missing truckers case," the headline read, and there was footage of the Dry Creek Motel with county vehicles visible in the background. The sound was off, but the closed captioning scrolled across the bottom of the screen, describing how a multi-year investigation had culminated in the arrest of a motel owner suspected in multiple disappearances. They didn't use Odessa's name yet. That would come later, after charges were formally filed, but they showed the motel prominently, and Hobart felt eyes turning toward him as other patrons recognized the location from his own description of where he'd been. He left money on the table for the coffee he hadn't drunk and headed back to his truck, suddenly desperate to be moving again, to put more distance between himself and that place. The delivery to Tulsa went smoothly once he finally got there, the warehouse workers efficient and professional, and no one asked why he was running hours behind schedule. He filed the paperwork, got his signature for the completed delivery, and headed back east toward his home terminal. The return trip was uneventful in the best possible way. Clear weather, light traffic, no emergencies or complications. Just mile after mile of ordinary highway driving, the kind that should have been boring but that Hobart found himself grateful for in a way he'd never been before. By the time he reached his terminal, 3 days had passed since he'd left Dry Creek Motel, and already the incident was starting to feel distant and unreal, like something that had happened to someone else. The news had moved on to other stories. The investigation was proceeding through official channels, and Hobart's life had returned to its normal rhythms of loads and deliveries and maintenance schedules. He did contact the victim services counselor that Blaine had recommended, had a few sessions talking through the experience, and found it helped in ways he hadn't expected. Not in making the memories go away, they would always be there, but in processing them, in understanding his reactions, and his continuing unease about isolated stops and rural motels. Weeks turned into months, and Hobart kept driving, kept taking loads across the country, but he found himself being more selective about where he stopped. He stuck to major truck stops whenever possible, avoided exits that led to single-establishment towns, and never again pulled off the highway during a storm without thoroughly researching what he'd find there. Some of his fellow drivers thought he was being paranoid, overly cautious, letting one bad experience color his judgment. But others understood, particularly those who'd been driving long enough to have their own close calls and narrow escapes. The road had dangers that most people never thought about, and truckers learned to recognize them or they didn't last in the profession. The case against Odessa proceeded through the courts, and Hobart received regular updates from the prosecutor's office. They'd found evidence linking her to at least 7 missing persons cases, with forensic work ongoing that might connect her to more. The property itself had revealed graves, exactly as Blaine had suspected, and the full scope of what had been happening at the Dry Creek Motel was slowly coming to light. Hobart would have to testify eventually, would have to face Odessa in court and describe what he'd witnessed, but that was a future problem he'd deal with when it arrived. For now, he focused on driving, on doing his job, on appreciating the ordinary safety of proper truck stops and well-lit highways. He thought sometimes about the other drivers who hadn't been as lucky as him, whose instincts hadn't kicked in at the right moment, or who'd trusted Odessa's hospitality just a little too much. They'd been people with families and friends and lives beyond the road, and they'd ended up as statistics in a case file, their trucks stripped and sold, their disappearances unexplained until it was far too late to save them. Hobart carried their memory with him now, a weight he hadn't asked for but that felt important somehow. They deserved to be remembered, deserved to have their stories told, deserved justice even if it came too late to help them. And if sharing his own experience could prevent future tragedies, could make other drivers more cautious about isolated stops during storms, then maybe something positive could come from the nightmare he'd survived. The rain still made him nervous, particularly heavy rain at night, and he found himself hyper-aware of motel signs and vacancy indicators in a way he'd never been before. But he kept driving through it, kept pushing past the anxiety, because that's what the job required, and because giving in to fear felt like letting Odessa win even from prison. The road was still his workplace, still his home in a way, and he wouldn't let one predator in one forgotten corner of Oklahoma take that away from him. So he drove on, through clear skies and storms, through daylight and darkness, carrying loads across the country and watching the mile markers tick past. Each trip was a small victory, a quiet defiance against the dangers that lurked in the margins, and Hobart found strength in that repetition, in the simple act of continuing despite what he now knew was possible. 6 months after the incident at Dry Creek Motel, Hobart found himself approaching Oklahoma again with a load of industrial machinery bound for Oklahoma City. The route didn't take him anywhere near Dry Creek. He'd specifically requested routing that avoided that entire county, but just crossing the state line brought back the memories with uncomfortable clarity. The sky was overcast, threatening rain, and every dark cloud felt like an omen. He'd been doing better, the counseling had helped, and most days he could drive without the constant hypervigilance that had plagued him in the immediate aftermath. But Oklahoma was different. Oklahoma was where it had happened, and his body remembered even when his rational mind tried to insist he was safe. The CB crackled to life with chatter from other drivers, the usual mix of traffic updates and complaints about fuel prices and weather speculation. Hobart had been mostly quiet on the CB since Dry Creek, listening more than talking, but something in the current conversation caught his attention. A driver was asking about good places to stop between Tulsa and Oklahoma City, mentioning that storms were forecast for later that evening, and he wanted to find shelter before they hit. Another driver started to recommend an exit, describing a small motel that was cheap and convenient, and Hobart's hands tightened on the wheel. He grabbed the CB microphone before he could talk himself out of it. "Breaker 19, this is Nighthawk," he said, using his CB handle. "Driver asking about stops between Tulsa and OKC. I'd recommend sticking to the major truck stops. Flying J at exit 37, Pilot at exit 52. Both are well lit, busy, safe." There was a moment of silence on the channel before the original driver responded. "Copy that, Nighthawk. Any particular reason to avoid the smaller places?" Hobart hesitated, trying to decide how much to say. The Dry Creek case had made regional news, but a lot of drivers wouldn't have connected the story to their own travel patterns. "Just personal experience," he finally said. "Isolated stops during storms can be risky. Better to stick with places that have traffic and witnesses." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Hobart's warning had been heard, and he told himself that was enough. He couldn't save everyone, couldn't protect every driver from every potential danger, but he could share what he'd learned and hope it made a difference. The miles rolled past, and eventually he pulled into a truck stop for fuel and food, going through the familiar routines of parking and fueling and checking his logs. Inside the travel center, he grabbed coffee and a sandwich, found a booth where he could watch the parking lot through the window, and tried to eat, despite a stomach that was still tight with the anxiety of being back in Oklahoma. His phone buzzed with a text from Ferris Blaine. Just a check-in, asking how Hobart was doing and mentioning that the trial date had been set for next month. Hobart would need to return to Oklahoma to testify, would need to face Odessa again and describe everything he'd witnessed. The thought made his appetite disappear completely, but he knew it was necessary. Was the price of justice for the victims who hadn't survived. He texted back a brief acknowledgement and put his phone away, trying to focus on finishing his meal. Another driver approached his booth, an older man with a weathered face and the kind of confident bearing that came from decades on the road. "Mind if I sit?" the man asked, gesturing to the empty side of the booth, and Hobart shrugged his acceptance. The man sat down with his own coffee and studied Hobart for a moment before speaking. "Heard you on the CB earlier talking about avoiding isolated stops. You're the Dry Creek guy, aren't you? The one who got away from that motel woman?" Hobart felt his defenses go up immediately, but forced himself to stay calm. "Yeah, that was me. You heard about it?" The older driver nodded slowly. "Whole industry heard about it eventually. Some of the missing drivers were people I knew, guys I'd crossed paths with over the years. What happened there? It's the kind of thing we all worry about, but hope never really happens." They talked for a while, the older driver sharing his own close calls and sketchy situations from years of hauling freight across the country. It was the kind of conversation that Hobart had been avoiding since Dry Creek, not wanting to dwell on the dangers of the profession, but now he found it oddly comforting. The acknowledgement that risk was part of the job, that other drivers understood and had their own strategies for staying safe, made him feel less isolated in his caution. Eventually, the older driver stood to leave, extending a hand. "Name's Cullen, by the way. If you ever need someone to talk to who gets it, you got my handle on the CB. Road veteran." Hobart shook his hand, appreciating the gesture more than he could articulate. "Nighthawk, thanks for understanding." The delivery to Oklahoma City went smoothly, and Hobart found himself with a few hours to kill before his next pickup. He drove past the courthouse where Odessa's trial would take place, an imposing building of red brick and white columns, and wondered what it would be like to sit in a witness box and describe that night. The prosecutor had prepped him over phone calls, walking through likely questions and cross-examination strategies, but Hobart knew that no amount of preparation could fully prepare him for facing the woman who'd tried to make him her next victim. He drove on, not stopping, just getting a sense of the location so it wouldn't be completely unfamiliar when he returned next month. His next load took him northeast through Missouri and into Illinois, familiar territory that felt safer than Oklahoma had. The weather cleared, and Hobart made good time, falling back into the rhythm of driving that had always been his refuge from stress. The road stretched ahead endlessly, and for a while he could almost forget about Dry Creek, could lose himself in the simple mechanics of navigation and traffic management. But then the sun would start to set, and shadows would lengthen, and he'd find himself checking his mirrors more frequently, watching for vehicles that might be following him, seeing threats in innocent situations. The hypervigilance was exhausting, but he couldn't seem to turn it off completely, couldn't quite trust the apparent safety of normal highway travel. A week later, he was back at his home terminal when his dispatcher called him into the office. "Got something unusual," the dispatcher said, pulling out a file folder. "Request came in from the prosecutor's office in Oklahoma. They want to know if you'd be willing to participate in something they're calling a victim impact presentation, basically talking to truck drivers about what happened at Dry Creek, helping educate the industry about the warning signs and how to stay safe." Hobart's first instinct was to refuse, to say he'd done enough by agreeing to testify, but the dispatcher continued before he could speak. "They're putting together a safety program to present at truck stops and industry conferences. Your story combined with some of the other cases could save lives. I told them I'd ask, but that it was completely your choice." Hobart took the folder and spent that evening reading through the proposal. It was comprehensive, a multimedia presentation about predatory behavior targeting truckers, warning signs to watch for, resources for reporting suspicious activity, and survivor testimony to make it personal and immediate. His participation would be voluntary and compensated, and they'd work around his driving schedule. The more he read, the more he realized this was an opportunity to do something meaningful with what had happened to him, to turn his trauma into something that could protect others. By the time he finished reading, he'd made his decision. He called the prosecutor's office the next morning and agreed to participate. The preparation for the victim impact presentation took several weeks and required Hobart to work closely with law enforcement and victim advocates to develop his story into something educational without being exploitative. They walked him through trauma-informed storytelling techniques, helped him identify the key decision points that had saved his life, and showed him how to present the information in a way that empowered listeners rather than just frightening them. It was difficult work, requiring Hobart to relive the experience in detail repeatedly, but it also gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing since the incident. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was someone who could help prevent future victims. The trial arrived in early spring, nearly 8 months after that night at Dry Creek Motel. Hobart drove to the courthouse in his personal vehicle rather than his rig, wearing the suit he kept for formal occasions that felt strange and constricting after so many months in comfortable driving clothes. The courthouse was busy with the usual flow of legal proceedings, but the Odessa Vier case had drawn particular attention. Media coverage and public interest focused on the sensational nature of the crimes. Hobart met with the prosecutor in a conference room before taking the stand, reviewing his testimony one final time and going over strategies for handling cross-examination. The prosecutor was a sharp woman named Harrigan, who'd built her case methodically over the past months, and she radiated confidence about the outcome. "Remember," Harrigan said as they prepared to enter the courtroom, "you're not on trial here. You're a witness to what happened, and your job is simply to tell the truth about what you saw and experienced. The defense will try to make it seem like you were mistaken or confused, but stick to the facts as you know them and you'll be fine." Hobart nodded, trying to project a calm he didn't entirely feel. They entered the courtroom through a side door, and Hobart got his first look at Odessa. Since that morning he'd fled the motel. She was sitting at the defense table in clothing that looked too large for her frame, her face carefully neutral, and when her eyes met his there was no recognition or emotion in them. She looked like any tired middle-aged woman, completely ordinary, and the disconnect between her appearance and what she'd done made Hobart's stomach turn. The testimony itself took most of the day, Harrigan leading him through a chronological account of his experience at Dry Creek Motel. Hobart described the storm, his decision to seek shelter, his interactions with Odessa, the suspicious activities he'd witnessed, and his eventual escape. He kept his voice steady and his answers direct, focusing on observable facts rather than speculation or emotion. The jury listened intently, several of them taking notes, and Hobart could see the impact his words were having. This wasn't an abstract case about missing persons reports. This was a living witness describing how close he'd come to being another victim. The cross-examination was more aggressive, the defense attorney trying to suggest that Hobart had misinterpreted innocent actions due to paranoia and exhaustion. Isn't it true, Mr. Quillen, that you were driving in dangerous conditions late at night after many hours behind the wheel? Isn't it possible that fatigue affected your perception of events? Hobart met the attorney's eyes steadily. I was tired, yes, but I wasn't so tired that I imagined someone checking door handles, or that I misheard the arguments about evacuation orders, or that I hallucinated my phone showing signal but not being able to connect. Those things happened, and they happened the way I described them. The attorney tried several more approaches, but Hobart held firm, and eventually he was dismissed from the stand. He sat in the gallery for the rest of the trial, listening to testimony from forensic experts about the evidence found on the property, from family members of missing truckers who'd never come home, from Ferris Blaine about his attempts to shut down the motel and the resistance he'd encountered. The picture that emerged was damning, a systematic operation that had been running for years, claiming victims who were specifically chosen because they were transient, and whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed. Odessa had been calculating and patient, waiting for the right combination of circumstances before acting. And she'd gotten away with it for so long because she'd understood how to exploit the vulnerabilities of her targets. The prosecution rested after 3 days, and the defense put on a briefcase arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, that Odessa had been running a legitimate business that happened to attract troubled people who then disappeared for unrelated reasons. It was a weak argument, and the jury saw through it quickly. Deliberations lasted less than 6 hours before they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. Multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, kidnapping, and various other charges that would ensure Odessa spent the rest of her life in prison. Hobart watched as the verdicts were read, and Odessa's expression never changed, remaining blank and unreadable even as her attorney slumped in defeat beside her. After the trial concluded, Hobart met with family members of some of the victims, people who'd been waiting years for answers about what had happened to their loved ones. The conversations were difficult but necessary, and Hobart found himself sharing details about the motel and the operation that helped them understand their relatives' final hours. It was painful work, but it felt important, giving these families a sense of closure that they'd been denied for so long. One woman, whose brother had disappeared 3 years earlier while hauling a load through Oklahoma, hugged Hobart and thanked him for surviving, for being able to tell the story that her brother couldn't. The embrace left him shaken in a way the trial itself hadn't, confronting him with the random chance that had separated his outcome from theirs. The Victim Impact Presentation Program launched a month after the trial, with Hobart as one of several speakers who traveled to truck stops and industry events to share their experiences. He found public speaking harder than he'd expected, the vulnerability of standing in front of a room full of fellow drivers and describing his near miss making him feel exposed in ways that testifying in court hadn't. But he also found it rewarding when drivers would approach him afterward with their own stories of suspicious situations they'd encountered, or to thank him for making them more aware of the risks they faced. The program was reaching people, changing behaviors, and Hobart took satisfaction in knowing that his trauma was serving a purpose beyond just his own survival. One evening, after a presentation at a truck stop outside Memphis, an older driver approached Hobart with a weathered logbook in hand. "I wanted to show you something," the driver said, opening the book to reveal decades of entries in fading ink. "I've been driving 42 years, and in that time I've made thousands of decisions about where to stop and when to push through. Some of those decisions were good, and some were lucky, but I realize now that I didn't always know the difference." He pointed to an entry from several years back. noting a stop at a location Hobart now recognized as being near Dry Creek. "I almost pulled off at that exit once, during a storm not unlike the one you described. Something made me keep going, find a different place. Hearing your story, I wonder if that instinct saved my life." The conversation stayed with Hobart long after the driver had left. This idea that countless small decisions and chance moments determined who survived and who didn't. He thought about all the times he'd driven past exits without taking them, about weather that had been bad but not quite bad enough to force him off the road, about the random factors that had aligned to put him at Dry Creek Motel on that particular night. There was no grand design to it, no cosmic justice that had chosen him to survive while others perished. It was just chance and instinct and the accumulated wisdom of years on the road that had given him the awareness to recognize danger when he encountered it. As spring turned to summer, Hobart found himself driving through Oklahoma again, this time with less anxiety than before. The trial was over. Odessa was in prison, and the Dry Creek Motel had been demolished by the county as part of closing the case. The exit still existed, but there was nothing at the end of it now except empty foundations and a historical marker that the county had installed describing what had happened there. Hobart didn't take the exit, but he noted it passing, acknowledging it without letting it control him. The fear wasn't gone completely, but it had diminished, replaced by a wary respect for the dangers that existed in the margins and a commitment to helping others recognize and avoid them. The Victim Impact Program continued to grow, expanding beyond just truck drivers to include other transient populations that might be vulnerable to similar predation. Hobart remained involved, though he limited his participation to once or twice a month to avoid letting it consume his life entirely. He was still a trucker first, still made his living hauling freight across the country, and he didn't want his identity to become defined entirely by what had happened at Dry Creek. The experience was part of him now, but it wasn't all of him, and maintaining that balance felt important for his long-term recovery. He started a blog at the suggestion of one of his counselors, writing about life on the road and safety practices and the lessons he'd learned from his experience. The writing came easier than the public speaking, allowing him to process his thoughts at his own pace and share them without the immediate vulnerability of face-to-face interaction. The blog found an audience among drivers who appreciated his practical advice, mixed with honest reflection about the psychological aspects of the profession. Comments and emails came in regularly, and Hobart found himself building a community of drivers who were willing to talk openly about the risks they faced and the strategies they used to stay safe. One of his blog posts described the concept of trusting your gut, explaining how instinct developed from experience could warn you of danger before your conscious mind recognized the signs. He detailed the small observations that had made him uneasy at Dry Creek, Odessa's odd mannerisms, the too clean detour signs, the phone that showed signal but couldn't connect, and how he'd learned to pay attention to those warning flags rather than dismissing them as paranoia. The post went viral within the trucking community, shared thousands of times, and sparking conversations about situational awareness and the importance of listening to intuition even when you couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong. Fall brought cooler weather and longer nights, and Hobart found himself actually appreciating the isolation of night driving again for the first time since Dry Creek. There was something meditative about rolling through darkness with just the highway ahead and your thoughts for company, and he'd missed that aspect of the job during the months when night driving had felt threatening rather than peaceful. He still preferred well-lit truck stops and avoided isolated exits during storms, but the paralyzing fear had faded to manageable caution. He was functioning again, not just surviving, but actually living, and that felt like a victory worth celebrating. The anniversary of that night at Dry Creek Motel arrived in late November, marking a full year since the incident. Hobart was hauling a load through Nebraska when the date registered, and he pulled off at a rest area to sit for a while and reflect. A year ago, he'd been trapped in a motel room, terrified and isolated, minutes away from becoming another victim. Now he was alive and working and helping others stay safe, had turned his trauma into something constructive rather than letting it destroy him. The journey hadn't been easy, and it wasn't over. He still had moments of anxiety, still struggled with trust issues around isolated locations, but he'd made it through and come out stronger on the other side. He thought about the victims who hadn't made it, whose names he now knew from the trial and from conversations with their families. They'd been people like him, drivers just trying to do their jobs, making reasonable decisions that had turned out to be fatal through no fault of their own. He thought about Odessa, locked away in prison for the rest of her life, and felt a complicated mix of satisfaction at the justice and sadness at the waste of it all. The lives destroyed, the families shattered, the years of careful predation that had gone undetected until finally someone had survived to tell the tale. It was a heavy weight to carry, but Hobart had learned he could carry it without being crushed by it. He finished his coffee and got back on the road, merging into traffic and heading west toward his delivery point. The landscape rolled past in familiar patterns, and Hobart found himself actually looking forward to the drive rather than dreading it. There would be more storms, more nights driving through rain and darkness, more exits and truck stops and lonely stretches of highway. But there would also be sunrises over mountains, and good conversations with fellow drivers, and the satisfaction of a load delivered on time. The road still held dangers, but it also held everything that had drawn him to trucking in the first place: freedom and solitude and the endless possibility of movement. And he wasn't going to let what had happened at Dry Creek take that away from him. The miles accumulated and the seasons turned, and Hobart kept driving, kept sharing his story, kept working to make the industry safer for everyone who made their living on the highways. It wasn't glamorous work, and it didn't undo what had happened, but it gave him purpose and connected him to a community of people who understood the unique challenges and risks of the profession. He'd survived something terrible and transformed it into something meaningful, and while he'd never be grateful for the experience itself, he could appreciate the person it had forced him to become: stronger, more aware, more compassionate toward others facing their own traumas. The road had nearly killed him, but ultimately it had saved him too, giving him a platform and a purpose that extended beyond just hauling freight from one place to another. As winter approached again, marking more than a year since Dry Creek, Hobart found himself training a new driver who was just starting in the industry. They were stopped at a truck stop in Kansas, going over proper shutdown procedures and pre-trip inspection routines, when the younger driver asked a question. How do you deal with the isolation? Being alone in the truck for days at a time, nobody to talk to, no backup if something goes wrong. Hobart considered the question carefully before answering. "You're never really alone out here," he finally said. "There are millions of us on these roads, all doing the same job, all looking out for each other in small ways. You learn to pay attention to the CB chatter, to the patterns of traffic, to your own instincts about when something doesn't feel right. And you learn that the isolation can be a strength if you let it. Time to think, to process, to figure out who you are when nobody's watching." The young driver absorbed this, nodding slowly, and Hobart recognized his own earlier self in that expression of tentative understanding. He remembered being new to the industry, learning the unwritten rules and developing the situational awareness that kept you safe. He'd come a long way since then, through years of experience and one terrible night that had accelerated his education in the darker aspects of the profession. But he'd made it through, and now he could help others navigate the same journey with hopefully fewer scars than he'd accumulated. It was a small kind of redemption, but it was real, and in the end, that was all any of them could hope for: to survive, to learn, to pass on wisdom to the next generation of drivers who would face their own challenges on these endless American highways. 2 years after Dry Creek Motel, Hobart pulled into a truck stop outside Little Rock during a storm that was worse than the forecast had predicted. The rain was coming down in sheets that turned the parking lot into a shallow lake, and his first instinct was the old, familiar anxiety, the tightness in his chest, the hyper-awareness of every exit and building, the urge to keep driving no matter how dangerous the conditions. But this time he recognized the response for what it was, acknowledged it without letting it control him, and made the rational decision to stop and wait it out at a proper facility with other drivers around and all the safety that came with a busy truck stop. Inside the travel center, he found a booth near the window and ordered coffee, watching the storm through rain-streaked glass while other drivers came and went around him. The familiar sounds and smells of the place were grounding: diesel fuel and hot food, and the constant background noise of CB chatter and conversation. This was his world, had been for 20-plus years now, and Dry Creek hadn't taken that away from him, even though it had tried. A young driver approached his booth, someone Hobart vaguely recognized from one of his safety presentations months ago, and asked if he could sit. Hobart gestured his acceptance, and the younger man sat down with obvious relief on his face. "I wanted to thank you," the driver said, his accent marking him as being from somewhere in the deep South. "I was hauling through Missouri last month. Storm came up fast like this one, and I saw an exit with one of those old roadside motels. My first thought was to pull off and wait it out there. But then I remembered your presentation, remembered you saying to stick with busy places where there's witnesses and traffic. So I kept going, found a proper truck stop 20 miles up the road." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Next day, I heard on the news that same motel got raided by state police. Turns out they were running some kind of cargo theft operation, drugging drivers and stripping their trucks. If I'd stopped there—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Hobart understood perfectly what the young driver was saying, that the information shared, the warnings given, had potentially saved him from becoming another victim of predators who saw truckers as easy targets. It was exactly the kind of impact that Hobart had hoped for when he'd agreed to participate in the safety program, but hearing it confirmed never got old. "I'm glad you trusted your instincts," Hobart said quietly. "That's what it comes down to most of the time, paying attention to that voice in your head that says something's wrong, even when you can't articulate exactly what it is." They talked for a while longer, Hobart sharing some of the lessons he'd learned not just from Dry Creek but from 2 decades of navigating the risks that came with the profession. The young driver listened intently, asking smart questions and clearly taking mental notes, and Hobart recognized the same hunger for knowledge that he'd had when he was starting out. Eventually, the driver thanked him again and headed back to his rig, and Hobart sat alone with his coffee watching the storm begin to ease. The rain was letting up, transitioning from downpour to steady shower, and the sky was lightening slightly toward the west where the system was moving off. His phone buzzed with a message from Ferris Blaine, something that had become a regular occurrence over the past 2 years. The former storm warden had retired from his county position and now worked with a national trucking safety organization, using his experience with the Dry Creek case to develop better protocols for identifying and shutting down operations that targeted drivers. He and Hobart had become friends of sorts, bonded by their shared mission to prevent future tragedies. The message was brief, just checking in, mentioning that another facility in Arkansas had been flagged for suspicious activity and was under investigation. The network they'd helped build was working, identifying threats before they could claim victims. Hobart replied with his own update and put his phone away, feeling that familiar mix of satisfaction and sadness that came from this work. Satisfaction that they were making a difference, that the system was getting better at protecting drivers. Sadness for all the victims who'd come before the improvements, who'd died or disappeared because the right protocols hadn't been in place. He carried their memory with him always, a responsibility he'd accepted when he'd chosen to turn his survival into advocacy. It was heavy some days, but it was also purposeful, giving meaning to what might otherwise have been just random trauma. The storm finally broke completely as evening approached, the clouds scattering to reveal a sky washed clean and bright. Hobart finished his coffee and headed back to his truck, doing his walk-around inspection by habit, even though the rig had only been parked for a few hours. Everything checked out fine, and he climbed into the cab, settled into the driver's seat that had molded to his shape over thousands of miles, and started the engine. The diesel rumbled to life with its familiar sound, and Hobart felt something in his chest ease, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying finally releasing. He was okay. He was safe. He was still doing the job he loved, despite everything that had tried to stop him. He pulled out of the truck stop and merged back onto the highway, the wet pavement reflecting the taillights of other vehicles in streaks of red. Traffic was light in the post-storm evening, and Hobart made good time, the miles clicking past on his odometer in a steady rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Somewhere ahead was his delivery point, and beyond that another load, and beyond that the endless sequence of jobs that made up a trucker's life. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't always safe, but it was honest work and it was his work, and he'd earned the right to keep doing it through survival and testimony and the hard work of recovery. He thought about Odessa sometimes, wondered what went through her mind during the long years stretching ahead of her in prison. He didn't waste energy on hatred. That would have meant letting her continue to affect his life in ways he wouldn't allow. But he did think about what had driven her to prey on people who'd only been seeking shelter from storms, and how many years she'd operated before finally being stopped. The justice system had done its job, had locked her away where she couldn't hurt anyone else. But justice didn't bring back the dead or erase the trauma of survivors. It was something, but it wasn't everything, and Hobart had learned to accept that limitation. The highway stretched ahead into darkness, and Hobart drove into it without fear, his headlights cutting through the night in familiar cones of light. Behind him, the storm continued to break apart, the clouds scattering to reveal stars that had been hidden for hours. Above him, the sky opened up vast and indifferent, and somewhere out there, other drivers were making their own journeys, facing their own challenges, surviving their own close calls. He couldn't protect all of them, but he could protect some, could share what he'd learned and hope it made a difference. And maybe that was enough. Maybe survival wasn't just about living through danger, but about what you did with the life you'd been given afterward, how you transformed pain into purpose and trauma into teaching. The CB crackled with the driver asking about road conditions ahead, and Hobart picked up the microphone. "Nighthawk here," he said. "Roads are clear. Weather's moving off to the east. It's good driving from here to Memphis if that's where you're headed." The other driver thanked him, and the channel went quiet again, and Hobart set the microphone back in its clip and kept driving. Just another night on the road, just another storm passed through, just another mile toward whatever came next. He'd survived Dry Creek Motel, and he'd survive whatever else the road threw at him. One delivery at a time, 1 mile marker at a time, one sunrise at a time. The road went on forever, and so would he. Carrying his scars and his stories and his hard-won wisdom into a future that no longer felt quite so threatening. He was alive, he was working, and he was making a difference. For now, that was more than enough.